Notre Dame fans, welcome back to another edition of the Irish Breakdown Podcast. It feels like it's been a while, Ryan, since you and I have done a show together. It's been since Friday. We had to take yesterday off because a little bit of a family emergency with one of us here, and so everything is good. Everything is great for all those who have reached out about Ryan's daughter, and prayed for Ryan's daughter. She's doing much better today. Spirits are back up, and everybody's good in the Roberts household, Ryan. So we're glad to have you back, and glad to be back and ready to talk about Notre Dame football, man. We just finished our last Saturday of no college football for the rest of the next however months, right? We'll get a couple in December, like late in December, but for the most part, no more Saturday list football, college football Saturday list days. So we're ready to rock and roll. Notre Dame, of course, is now less than 2 weeks away from kicking off the 2022 season. We got a lot really planned out these next week and a half plus as we get ready for the game. And Ryan, today we're going to talk about the Notre Dame defense, and specifically we're going to talk about the front seven. And as we kind of finish our sort of expectations and projections into the 2020 season on a position by position basis, we're going to kind of mold the front seven together today instead of breaking them down. And I really think the two have to go together. And the reality is, Ryan, is the Notre Dame defense has really been the backbone of this football team, really starting in 2018 to now. Mm-hmm. And there's it's not the same every year, much better in some years than others, but even within seasons, games where it didn't look as great, but for the most part, the defense has really been the part of the team that's carried Notre Dame. But the reality is if Notre Dame is going to take that next step as a program, start winning some of these big games, get to the college football playoff, and be a team that people fear, be a team that can go win games in the postseason, not just get there and be happy that they didn't lose to the champion by as much as the team that lost to the champion in the playoff or in the championship game, right? Like that's been Notre Dame's claim to fame, according to the guy that used to be the head coach in both years. Well, we didn't lose as badly as a team that lost in the championship game, right? No more of that, right? It's like, okay, get there and do something, right? Get that W. If that's going to be what Notre Dame's going to get to, or when Notre Dame gets there, yes, the offense has to get a lot better, but so does the defense. And really, this is the part of the team that is expected to be the strength, especially the front four. The reality is, Ryan, is that in 2022, Notre Dame can't just be what they've been on defense in recent seasons. They have to be better.
Right. It's something that I don't think we talk about enough, to be honest, Brian. Like, I think that most people talk about the offensive side of the football and talk about the fact that they need massive improvements. They need to get to this level and this point per game. And I agree with all that. But also, I think that there's a full scope of a program where you have to look at the defense and also say, good enough isn't always good enough, right? Like, to be a championship level team, you have to match some of these teams like the Alabamas, the Georgias, those teams that have made a brand of football off of being physical and being explosive and doing all those types of things. So I really do think that the defensive side of the football, we talked about the baseline. What was it, last week or the week before? Like, the baseline's they're going to be a good defense. Like, I would be very surprised if this was not a good defense in 2022. But there's a big
define that, right? Like, because I think I want people to understand what they are and what they need to be. So define I'm assuming you're talking about like a top 20-ish defense, which is what they've been, right?
Yeah, I would say we've seen the standard over the last couple of years, like whether it's from Mike Elko to Clark Lee to Marcus Freeman and to where we are now under the tutelage of Marcus Freeman, but now with Al Golden, they've been a good defense. Like you said, like a top 20 national team on that side of the football. And I think it's minimalizing the impact of an offense, right? Like they come into a game and you should expect an offense to look worse than what they traditionally are against a Notre Dame defense. Like, that's what the baseline is for me. But there's a big difference between that and being a dictating defense where you just shut people down. When an offensive side of the football maybe isn't rolling at full capacity, doing the best, you can keep a team in a football game. And we've seen Notre Dame do that in spurts. I mean, like, I even think about that Clemson game in 2018, right, where it was like 30-3. I was like, the defense played pretty well for the most part of that game. Like, they minimalized, aside from a couple big plays, the Clemson offense for what it had been on a week-to-week basis that season. But Notre Dame needs to be better. They need to break it up a notch because there is a big separation between good and great, and there's even a bigger separation between great and elites. Can Notre Dame be an elite defense in 2022? It's possible, but either way, they need to be better than what they have been, because there's a lot of good football players on this team, and there's still a tick up that each one of them can take, and that this defense can take in order to be a true championship level defense.
And I think that's the thing, Ryan, is that unit that dictates, that says, hey, listen, look, you're going to have to completely shut our offense down, because if you don't completely shut our offense down, you're not going to win this football game. I mean, That's what Georgia was last year, right? Like Alabama's had several national championship teams like that. And even now, Bama will have games like that where you got no chance. Now, this is not the same Bama defense it's been in the past. We've talked about that. But their offense is insane. And Notre Dame's offense is not going to make that kind of jump. Now, is Notre Dame's offense going to be better? We expect it to be. We think it certainly has a chance to be. But going from 35 points to 45 points is a different animal against the schedule they're going to play. And that's kind of where Bama usually is, right? I mean, last year was a quote unquote down year for the Alabama defense for offense from a scoring standpoint. They scored 39.9 points per game. And if you take out the two playoff games against two really, really good defenses in Cincinnati, who had like 6 kids from that defense get drafted,
it was loaded,
including a corner with number 4 overall, and then of course the Georgia defense, which was the best defense in college football last year. Mm-hmm. You take those away, then they're back into the 40s, right? And the year before they were 48.5, in 2019 47.2, 2018 45.6. That's not the kind of leap we're talking about Notre Dame making on offense. So what we need to see from the Notre Dame defense is they can't afford to be like Alabama, where they can go get into these shootouts and hang a 41 spot on Georgia's defense. I'm not asking for that. What I am asking is for you to shut Georgia's defense down, so Notre Dame only has to score 24, 27, 30 to win those football games. And in a lot of the games Notre Dame has played in recent years, the defense has done that to a degree. Part of it is because they've gotten big leads and the offense doesn't do its part and the other team stops kind of running their offense, right? Like once Clemson got up 30-3, they kind of went into cruise control. Once Bama went up 31-7 in the Cotton Bowl or Rose Bowl 2 years ago, they went on cruise control, which impacted the total point. So no more needs to be done. And you've got to make more plays in those big games. You've got to force more turnover. You got to do everything's got to be better. The play's got to be better. And, the reality is, Ryan, is, are you familiar with like the Fremeau efficiency index, what Brian Fremeau does? Okay. He's an analytics guy, stats guy. And look, there's nothing that I look at, Ryan, and I'm like, oh, that's perfect. That's the perfect system. I find no flaws. And so I don't look for that. But I look for people that kind of have like a reasonable view of how to evaluate numbers relative to who you're playing. And when you look at the Fremeau efficiency index, he's had Notre Dame as being a pretty good defense, speaking to what you're referring to. And if you look at like the 3 years prior, Notre Dame ranked between 48th and 55th in defense in the 3 years prior to the 2017 turnover. I think it was like 48th in 2016 against a really bad schedule, 55th and 54th the 2 years before that, which for a team with Notre Dame's talent is really bad. In the last 5 years, Notre Dame has finished 15th, 20th, 6th in 2019, 24th, and 11th, which is good. It's good. But there's a difference between – it's just like in the top 25 team. There's a difference between being 11th or 6th and being 1, 2, or 3. Sure. And if you look at the numbers, even the year that Notre Dame finished 6th, there was a big difference between them and, the top 4 teams. And that's where we talk about is it's that next level to where you don't have to get it. You don't have to beat Ohio State 44-41 to win that game. You don't have to go to triple overtime to beat Clemson 47-40, right? It doesn't get there, right? And those are the things that we look at and say this defense has got to get better. And if that's going to happen, it's got to start up front, and then that's got to then play off into the linebackers. And that's kind of why we're doing them together. And when you look at the defensive line, Ryan, this has been the strength of the Notre Dame defense really going back to 2018. And at times in 2017, I thought they started showing glimpses of being that defense in 2017. I thought the D-line at times that year was really good. It held up quite well against Georgia, considering. Held Georgia with Georgia had 3 first-round draft picks at running back on that team, and they all played. DeAndre Swift ripped off a 50-plus yard run on a jet sweep outside. It was an outside-the-box jet sweep where a Notre Dame guy missed a tackle, if you remember that play. They ran for about 130 yards outside of that. In the yards per carry is around 4.0. That's pretty good against that offensive line and those running backs, right? But not great. Not what Georgia did to the Notre Dame offense and the Notre Dame running game, right? Held it below 100. And that game to me is the epitome of the difference. You know, you look at the 2018 game where Notre Dame did a pretty good job of keeping Clemson in check, but Clemson's defense completely dominated the Notre Dame offense, right? And that's the difference, right? And so that's where Notre Dame needs to get to, in my opinion. Now, I didn't bring up the Alabama game for a reason, because I think that game was more about Notre Dame's offense not being good, being injured, quarterback not making plays that were there, than it necessarily was Bama's defense playing great. Where in Clemson in 2018, we've talked about Ian Book needs to climb the pocket and bang that post route, but it was still going to require a great throw, because it's not like AJ Terrell was completely toasted on the plate, right? Like there's because that's going to be true in every game. And if you're a good team, you're going to get 3 or 4 opportunities to make big plays. Clemson only had 3 or 4 opportunities to make big plays. They hit on all of them.
They made them.
Notre Dame had 3 or 4 opportunities, and they only hit on one of them. And it was when the game was out of line, and that's the difference. So that's Notre Dame's offense has got to make those plays, but Clemson didn't allow them because they shut down the run game. They took away what Notre Dame did best. Notre Dame hasn't always been able to do that in big games, to take away what another team does best. And if they're going to do that, it's going to have to come from the D-line. And perfect example is the opener against Ohio State. You got to stop the run. I know everybody talks about the vaunted Ohio State pass attack, but when Ohio State's offense is really rolling, they're balanced.
Yeah.
And that's what you got to do. You got to control up front to shut down the run game and then get pressure on the quarterback. Well, who's going to have to do that? It's the D-line. And so when we look at the D-line, Ryan, and we talk about how it's got to take its game to another level, I think there's a couple things you look at. Number one, even though the sack numbers are really good last year, I think there's a lot of third down sacks, which they're still good, right? They're drive enders.
Sure.
But, Notre Dame needs more early down pressures. When they did that against USC in the first half, they kind of shut USC down. Then USC did some things to kind of negate that and, move the ball a few times to get some points. But then you look at a game like North Carolina where they were disruptive, but they made a lot of mistakes, missed tackles, missed sacks, missed run stops, missed run fits. Those are the things this front 4, not just the secondary and the linebackers. The front 4's got to get better at. They got to be more consistently disruptive, especially against the run game, and they've got to finish better. That, to me, the talent's there. That, to me, just as a group, we'll get into some specific players here in a second, but as a group, those are the 2 areas, Ryan, where this unit has to take a big jump forward. Be more disruptive, especially against the run, and finish.
Yes. Well, it's so important, Brian, because this Notre Dame defensive line, guys talk about it all the time on this channel, right? Everyone talks about it. Notre Dame's interior defensive line is smaller. Why? Because Notre Dame is an attack style defense that is trying to create penetration. And when you are that type, you are a playmaking team. You are not a Georgia where you have 350-pound nose tackle Jordan Davis that is holding the point of attack and is saying, linebacker, Nakobe Dean and Quay Walker and all these dudes run and make all the tackles. Like, this is not what this defense is predicated on. This defense is predicated on the front 4, front 3, whatever they're rotating in, creating havoc in the backfield. And when that is the fact, you need those guys to make some plays, man. Like, you need them to finish. I mean, we talk about Jason Adamalola. I mentioned it in the article I wrote about him, where I think that he is very underrated. But the simple fact of the matter is that Jason needs to finish more, right? Isaiah Foskey had 10 sacks and 12 tackles for loss last year?
12 and a half, yeah.
12 and a half. In the run game, he needs to finish more. He does, because he holds the point of attack. He's incredibly disruptive, but he needs to finish. That goes for every defensive lineman there. Howard Cross, you are not the biggest guy in the world, but what you are is cat quick and disruptive. You need to finish. Jacob Lacey, you need to finish. Riley Mills, we expect big things out of him. He also needs to show that he can finish. And the, there is there is definitely something to be said about creating pressure, right? And being disruptive. But also, the great defenses, I believe, are the ones that not only disruptive and create pressure, but also can finish, right? Finish sacks, finish the running backs on the ground. That is the separation for me from a great defense, because you can be a great defense and just create pressure, but a great defense and being an elite defense, that's the one where you don't have to worry about them running backs getting to the second level, because guys are finishing more in the backfield. So that's the separator for me. They are a good to very good defense if they play around the same level that they did last year, but to be a truly elite team, to take a step up, they need to finish more. And I think that they have all the talent to. There's not a lack of athleticism. There's not a lack of length. There's not a lack of just athletic ability in general. But Notre Dame needs to finish more. Their dudes are a part of this equation. They need to finish. And I think they have all the talent to do so.
Finishing, what does that mean, right? When we talk about finishing, obviously there's the obvious one when Jason Adamiola or Isaiah Foskey or Justin Adamiola get a pressure and you get a running back or quarterback squared up, you get them. But I think the reason that we kind of talked about this as a unit first is because it's not always that. And at times, a lot of times in recent years, but especially last year, one of the issues was one guy would have like a great penetration play. And then that he wouldn't be able to finish. And then the quarterback would take off running or get out of the pocket, or the running back would make a miss and then take off running.
Yep.
Not all the time, but at times was the issue, because at times the block destruction was very inconsistent across the board. And the nice thing that when you look at Georgia, for example, and they're just, they get a great push, but then there's always somebody there when the first guy doesn't make the play. Because sometimes the first guy there doesn't make the play because he just drove someone in the backfield. And that's okay. When the quarterback then sidesteps him, somebody else is right there to take him. And that's what we haven't always seen. You know, J.D. Bertrand, we've talked a lot about J.D. having that sack opportunity late in the second quarter against Oklahoma State. Well, you know what? When he missed on that, where was everybody else? Right. And why didn't somebody else like get on Spencer Sanders before he could recover and then take off running for a big gain? And so that's part of it too. And that comes from consistency and block destruction that needs to be better than it was a year ago. I think part of this is what they competed against. I think it was much easier for them in practice to go beat the offensive line without having to be great at block destruction. I think that'll improve. But that's the thing, Ryan, is it's got to be a team effort with the defense. And that's why, you include the linebackers. And that was an even bigger issue, because the defensive line would, have two guys be disruptive, and then next thing you know, their linebackers are nowhere to be seen, or they miss a tackle 2 yards down the field. Mm-hmm. And that's why these two got to play together. But the defensive line, when I talk about finishing, it is partly like what we saw against Wisconsin. I think that was a big reason they were so good against Wisconsin. The first guy there was making the play a lot of times, whether it was knocking the ball out or hitting the running back and holding them up until the rest of the troops could come. That was a big part of that success. But then other games that, Jason Adamiola would have a great pass rush. He would then not be able to quite get off the block, and then there was nobody there to get there, or Isaiah. And so we've got to see more consistency there. Again, are there snaps where we can show that they were that way? Yeah, lots of them.
Sure.
But the problem for the Notre Dame defense last year wasn't that they weren't good most snaps. It's they were really inconsistent, and they'd have some bad snaps, and that would result in Sam Howell taking off and running for 100 yards, or Ty Chandler ripping off a 50-yard touchdown run on a play where you're like, how did that play go for 50 yards? Instead of sacking Spencer Sanders at the end of the second quarter, whiffing him, he runs for 20-plus yards. Next thing you know, getting the ball back with a couple minutes left, up 28-7 with maybe a chance to score against a team that has not been able to stop you the whole half, turns into 28-14 at halftime. They start the ball with the second half of the ball. Next thing you know, before your offense gets back on the field, it's 28-27 deficit. Your offense scores. Next time they get on the field, it's 28-21. Different ball game. Why? Because you didn't finish. Because one guy would do one thing disruptive, and then the rest of the guys weren't there to finish it. And I think that's a big, big part. I mean, if that's the only thing that improves on this team this year, that alone makes this defense significantly better from a production standpoint, which then keeps the points down. Because again, if all they did was tackle better against Oklahoma State, that's not only a Notre Dame win, I think it's a convincing double-digit Notre Dame win.
I agree.
Right? So we're not talking about like they got to recruit 87 new players, right, or change their scheme. It's finish better. It's the fundamental aspects better. That's going to be the big thing for me. And it's got to be a group effort, Ryan. It can't just be, okay, Adamiola's, you guys got to finish better on this play. No, it's, okay, Justin had a great pass rush, forces the quarterback to scramble, and then he steps right into the waiting arms of Jacob Lacey or Jason Adamiola or Howard Cross or Riley Mills or Isaiah Foskey or Maris Luafau or J.D. Bertrand or Bo Bauer or whoever. Mm-hmm. It's that swarming part of the defense that wasn't always there last year. And that's going to be a big key for Al Golden is, can you get this defense to where you don't design something where one guy gets through, and if he doesn't hit, you're in trouble. It's one where you've designed something where one guy gets through, but the players are taught block destruction and getting off pressure, getting off blocks, getting to the quarterback, getting to the ball carrier, gap discipline, lane discipline, things like that they were not good at last year all the time. Getting those things better, so that way, if that one pressure that was well designed misses, the quarterback, running back has nowhere to go because there's somebody else or two other somebodies there to make those plays. That's what we talk about when we say the front has to get better at being disruptive and finishing. It's those type of things. And we've talked a lot about finishing, Ryan, but we wanted to kind of go on a little bit more of a descriptive manner of what that means and what that looks like. And because it is so vitally important to this defense taking the next step. If that's all that they do better this year, this jumps from a top 12 to 15 defense to a top 5 to 7 defense, just on that alone.
Yep.
Just on that alone.
Well, I mean, Brian, I know we're talking mostly 2021 to 2022 progression, but I mean, think about it for like the Notre Dame perspective. Like I think back to the Clemson game in 2018. How many times did Trevor Lawrence just kind of, shrug off a sack and was able to extend the play?
Yeah.
Talk about the Alabama game in 2020, that long run by Najee Harris should have been a tackle for loss, or at least at the line of scrimmage. Like there has been plenty of plays. I even think about Devonta Smith in that game where he just gets a little screen, a little bubble screen, and you're in solid position, but you just can't finish for X, Y, and Z reasons, right? So I think littered across this just fundamental understanding of finishing better is the fact that we've seen them not be able to finish in those big games. That is the Achilles heel to this Notre Dame team right now. Like it is. Notre Dame has gotten to a solid level, but they haven't been able to beat the best teams in college football over the last few years. And I think in every one of those games that they have lost to, Clemson, Alabama, when you think of the plays that maybe determined a little bit of those scores beginning lopsided, it's because they're in position, but they didn't finish. And I think that's been kind of a running theme, not only last year, now it's been over
the
last
Alabama game
years.
in 2020. That's another example. How many missed tackles do they have on balls completed behind the line of scrimmage?
Exactly.
I've talked about this. Go look at the big run that Najee Harris had early. Defensive line blows him off the ball, but nobody could get off a block.
Yep.
And then you have a corner miss a ball in space. Well, that's all fine and great that you beat them off the line and you were disruptive and all that. But as we've talked about, that doesn't matter if you don't bring the ball carrier down. I mean, there was another play. I mean, this is all while the game is in doubt. They have this great, well-designed blitz. Two guys come free, including Maris Liufau, and they allow Mac Jones to spin out because somebody lost lane discipline. And Mac Jones, who had -9 yards rushing on the season coming into that game, spins out and picks up a first down. Yep. I can't remember if he threw it or ran it, but they picked up a first down. Yeah. But like plays like that have to start ending with sacks and tackles for loss. And in the Clemson game, it's a little different because I feel like in that game, they did have a lot of those finishers. I think of the play where Julian Ekwara limps off the field on second down, and now it's third down. If Clemson doesn't gain another yard, they're in field goal range. Clemson drops back to throw. Adetokunbo Ogundeji comes off the edge, sacks Trevor Lawrence, and knocks him out of field goal range. Right, so that defense was even better at it, but it just was one of those things where there was just enough plays in there where you couldn't finish, and because your offense wasn't able to be that team, you weren't able to go out there and get it done. And so when I look at this matchup, it's like, okay, you're facing a very similar offense on September 3rd. Look, with all due respect to Jackson Smith and Jigba and Marvin Harrison and Emeka Egbuka, this is not like the first time Notre Dame has faced this kind of offense, with all due respect. Okay, they faced an offense that had Trevor Lawrence, Travis Etienne, Justin Ross, T. Higgins, Hunter Renfrow a few years ago. They faced an offense that had Mac Jones and Devontae Smith and Najee Harris 2 years ago. The defense didn't get it done in those games, right? So I'm not like, hey, they've stopped this kind of offense before. Notre Dame's going to win by 40. I don't cover Ohio State. We don't talk like that, right? We're actually give real analysis here. But they held their own in those games, is my point, at times. Now they got to finish better. So those plays that in the past were, boy, if Dante Vaughn just could have finished that play that he tipped the ball and the guy still caught it for a touchdown. If this guy just would have tackled Trevor Lawrence the first time and not let him get off and get that ball off. If just the corner would have, right? There's been too many of those. If just this would have happened, it's a different ball game. And that's the thing that's got to change. And it comes back down, as we said, to finishing. And
It's all fundamental stuff too, Brian. Because like I even think about Troy Pride. It's like Troy Pride was always in great position, but when the ball's in the air, just seemed like he couldn't always finish. Right? Like it's been a fundamental problem. Like I mean, honestly has been. If we're being completely honest, like the only corner I can remember that really like finished through the catch point was Julian Love, who was probably the smallest and I mean, he wasn't a great
and a lot
athlete.
of his stuff was coming downhill. I mean, that but to your point, you're correct. We haven't seen that a lot.
I mean, like Cam Hart, right? I mean, I know we're talking about the front seven today, but even 6'2.5", 32+ inch arm Cam Hart, he has all the tools to be a disruptive player at the catch point. Maris Loifow, if we're flowing to the football, working in pursuit, and he has a chance to make a play in the backfield, he has the length and the athleticism to finish plays, right? So if they are not able to finish plays, it's a fundamental problem. It's not an athletic problem. There's not physical limitations to an Isaiah Foskey getting off the block, right? The kid probably has 35-inch arms and he's 260 something pounds. Like he is a physically impressive player. Maris Loifow can do those things working inside and out. Cam Hart can disrupt the catch point because he has all the length and athleticism to do so. There's no excuses for not finishing plays because Notre Dame has all the talent to do so. It's just the fundamental aspect of the position. And that's why you always see those drills littered in practice of like little simplistic stuff where you're like, why are they practicing that? It's because you need to be disruptive in that phase, that catch point phase, that tackling phase, that in space phase. You need to do all those things. And Notre Dame has all the physical talent to do so. It's just about attention to detail, attention to detail, attention to detail.
And that's what we're going to learn about Marcus Freeman and his staff. Does that change or not? Now, we'd like to say, yes, it's going to be different now, but we don't know. We don't know. I mean, and again, I don't want to point to I could give all types of spin in one direction or another, right? Oh, the bowl game doesn't count because he didn't have his coaching staff. He only had 15 practices. True. But then you can also say, well, that's the only game we've seen him coach and they didn't tackle. And also true, which is why I just don't care about the bowl game. They've had now a whole offseason to take his identity as a football coach, a whole different coaching staff than that football team, different roster, different players, all that type of stuff. So now it's about what are you going to prove? What are you going to show? Right. And I think that's going to be the key for Marcus Freeman as his team as a whole that goes on both sides of the ball. And then, of course, now with Al Golden in charge of the defense, what is he going to bring to the table? And those are the things that I'm looking for. And I think the biggest area where this has to get better, Ryan, and this defensive line especially has to get better and more productive and disruptive and finish is in the run game. Notre Dame's defense, and we'll talk more about this in some previews, but this finishing thing, I think the pass game finishing mistakes are the most blatant and obvious because it's like JD right there and just whiffs on the quarterback, right? Everybody saw it. It's like when a cornerback gets beat, everybody sees it. Well, you didn't see the 30 snaps before when the quarterback didn't even look at the guy because he was so well covered. You see that one time he got beat, right? And sometimes a kid could play not well, but you don't notice it because he's just not in that exposed in space area, right? Where this unit has to get better and consistently better is they have to be not only more disruptive, but they have to make more plays in the run game. And if you look at Notre Dame's numbers last year, there was some disturbing numbers, especially about last year's team. And it's always been a bit of an issue, but last year was significantly better. So like, for example, last year, Oklahoma State finished the year with 56 sacks. They had the most sacks per game with 4 sacks per game. They played in 14 games. Notre Dame in 13 games had 41 sacks. Notre Dame averaged over 3 sacks per game. Now, obviously, if you project that over to it, Notre Dame plays an extra game. Notre Dame would have had 44 sacks. So 10 behind Oklahoma State, which is less than 1 a game, right? So sacks-wise, Notre Dame ranked 12th last year in sacks per game. They were really good at that. The problem, however, and we talked about this last week, is when you look at the total tackles for loss, Oklahoma State averaged 8.4. They had 117 tackles for loss. That means last season they had 56 run game, like they had 56 pass game stops, but they also had, I'm doing the math here a little bit, 61 run game stops, right? So tackles for loss include sacks and then run game production, right? So 117 tackles for loss, 56 sacks, that's 61 run game stops. They ranked second in the nation last year in total tackles for loss, first in the nation last year in tackles for loss per game. Notre Dame, on the other hand, averaged 6.3 tackles for loss per game. And they ranked 48th in total tackles for loss. And they ranked, I'm going down here real quick, they ranked 51st in total tackles for loss. Now, if you look at that and consider the gap between the run game production and the pass game production, that is a really big difference between the two teams. Notre Dame had 41 fewer, so there was a 41 gap between the run game and the sack production. 61 for Oklahoma State. That's closer to where you want to be. If you're going to have 41 sacks, you have to be more productive from a tackle for loss standpoint. And I think that's the thing to me that made Notre Dame last year kind of disappointing. I mean, you look at the top 3 teams in the country last year when it came to production against the run. It was, total tackles for loss. It was Alabama, Oklahoma State, and Pittsburgh all ranked 1, 2, and 3 in tackles for loss. Well, they ranked 1, 2, and 3 in sacks. They were kind of on the same plane. And then you look at you look at Michigan State, for example, last year. Michigan State was a team that had a lot of sacks too, 43 sacks last year, which was in 13 games, which was obviously a couple better than Notre Dame's. But Michigan State, like Notre Dame, ranked 40th in tackles for loss. Well, what's the difference between Michigan State's defense and those other 3 defenses? Their defense wasn't very good last year. It had a lot of sacks, but it was a bad defense. Why? Because they couldn't consistently be disruptive on all downs. They'd get a lot of sacks, but they also had the worst pass defense in college football last year. Why? Because they weren't a disruptive defense on the whole. And so Notre Dame's run game production this year has to take a big jump. If they don't get more sacks this year, I don't really care about that. I care about 2 things: more hits on the quarterback and more production in the run game, more negative production in the run game. Those are the 2 areas, Ryan, where if this defense is going to get better, they may even have a couple fewer sacks. I don't care. As long as it means more tackles for loss in the run game. And because here's what I mean by that. If you could have fewer sacks because of a lot of factors, right? Mm-hmm. But if you're doing it right, you're going to have more run game production, meaning more tackles for loss, which means putting teams in more third down situations, which means a couple things. You're going to have opposing defenses are going to have a lower completion percentage because you may not get a sack on third down. But what you do have is you put them in a 3rd and 9 and the quarterback's throwing the ball away more, right? Mm-hmm. Instead of 3rd and 4, he may hold on to it a little longer thinking, I can make this play. On 3rd and 10, he's like, okay, nobody's open. I'm not getting sacked. I'm throwing the ball away, right? But you're going to create more issues there. You're going to create more turnovers. You're going to create more opportunities where you're able to just be more overly disruptive, which is going to manifest itself in turnovers and I think in a lower 3rd down margin. Now Notre Dame last year on defense was a good 3rd down defense. They were good. They were ranked 10th in 3rd down attempts, but the 3rd down defense last year. But the problem that I had with their defense last year, Ryan, is I thought at times they gave up too many 3rd down attempts. Sure. They ranked last year nationally. I'm trying to find them here. They ranked 79th in 3rd down opportunities last year. That's not where you want to be. It means they gave up the 78 teams had fewer 3rd down opportunities than them last year. And that's an area where, to me, Notre Dame has got to get better. The percentage is good, but the reality is you're getting into too many of those 3rd down opportunities because you're allowing more chain moving drives at different times in the game, right? That's the difference. You're not getting enough 3 and outs. And those are the different and those come from what? Disruptive on early downs.
Yep.
And so the run game is there, disruptive in the pass game, which comes from it all stems from the run game, right? And why you guys talk about the run game? Because if you're good in the run game, it means teams are going to find themselves in more 2nd and longs, more 3rd and longs, less 3rd down. The last thing you want to be, Ryan, you were a defensive coach. Mm-hmm. The last thing you wanted to be in on 3rd down was a down where a situation where you didn't know if they were going to run or pass.
Yep.
I mean, because they're in that 3rd and 3, 3rd and 4 situation. Even like 3rd and 5 is somewhat, depending on your run game, is somewhat like, you may be able to do something, especially if you have a mobile quarterback. Mm-hmm. You want to be in a situation where I know they're going to pass or they're just not going to move the chain, right? And yep. Notre Dame wasn't in enough of those last year, in my opinion, to really be a difference maker, like the elite defense that it needed to be.
Well, and again, I talked about this a little bit already, Brian, but it's the simple fact of people, again, ask all the time about Notre Dame has smaller defensive linemen, defensive tackles at least, or defensive ends are pretty big. Why does that matter? Where does it hurt you? It hurts you if you are not creating disruptive plays, because at that point, it's like you don't want Howard Cross to work the point of attack and hold two gaps. Like that's not his game, right? Like you want him to one gap, penetrate, and be a disruptive football player. And to be successful in that particular scheme, in a one gap system, you have to create plays behind the line of scrimmage and you have to finish. We're going back to the finishing thing for a second. If you are becoming a point where your guys can't get off of blocks and maybe they're creating a little bit of penetration, but they can't finish those plays, they can't create those tackle for loss opportunities, then not only are you going to be behind the chains, to your point, but you're also going to be in situations where your defensive tackles and defensive linemen in general are not playing to their strengths. Like that is just the point blank to it. You want this team to play to the strengths. How do they play to their strengths? You let them take the shackles off, let them go, right? That's the first and foremost. You need to play to their strengths as far as being athletic and being explosive. After that, you want to get to those third and eights, not only because just from a defensive perspective, that is the most optimal thing, like to your points, right? Like I wanted to know that it's a 3rd and 9 so that I can get my right package defensively in, or I can, be aggressive with how I want to go after a quarterback, all those things. But also that's how your defensive line wins in general, right? Like you're playing to your strengths at the end of the day. The best coaches know exactly who they are, what their identity is, and they format a scheme to take advantage of it. Notre Dame knows what their scheme is. Whether they are a 3-down team or they're a 4-down team, they need to be explosive and they need to create penetration. So in that type of defense, tackle for loss numbers matter, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like, again, going back to Georgia for a second, if Jordan Davis doesn't have a ton of tackle for loss numbers, you're still a very successful defense because he's holding the point of attack. He's two-gapping. He's letting guys run free. If a Jason Adamalola doesn't have higher tackle for loss numbers, then that's telling me that someone's not finishing correctly or he's not being used properly. Like those are the things that are going to happen in this defense. So for this defense particular, where you don't have the biggest defensive tackles of all time, you need to finish in the backfield and you need to create those tackle for losses. That is how this defense is designed, and this is how this defense needs to win. Stay in front of the chains. Do not allow those 3rd and 3s, 3rd and 4s, because your defense is not designed for that. Your defense is designed for 3rd and 7, 3rd and 8, 3rd and 9. That's how you're going to win.
Here's a fascinating. Notre Dame had some very fascinating statistics on defense last year, Ryan. Statistics that you don't often see going together. Here's what I mean. Notre Dame last year, they played some bad teams last year, but what Notre Dame did play is a decent number of good offenses, teams that could score. They finished 14th last year in scoring defense, which is really good. I mean, it's not elite, but it's really good. That's what we've talked about. This defense has been really good. It just hasn't been elite yet, more often than not. But they finished 43rd in total defense and 37th in yards per play. That's a pretty big gap in that regard. Here's some reasons why. Last year, for example, Notre Dame finished 10th in 3rd down conversion defense. That's a really good place to be. But they finished 79th in regard to giving up the most 3rd down opportunities. And it's the same thing in the red zone. And this is like you look at Notre Dame's red zone defense last year, and the numbers are really fascinating. Let me pull it up right now. So last year, if you look at the Notre Dame defense, they finished 39th in total red zone defense. That's okay, but not what you'd expect from a team that finished that high in scoring. Well, here's the reason why. Last year, their touchdown defense ranked 4th nationally. 4th. Yet they finished 39th overall. Why? Because they finished 129th, second to last, in field goal percentage last year, meaning teams were getting into the red zone a lot against Notre Dame last year. And if you look at red zone opportunities last year, Notre Dame ranked 74th in red zone opportunities, meaning there were 73 teams that gave up fewer red zone trips than Notre Dame did. So for Notre Dame to finish 14th in scoring, but 79th, 74th in red zone opportunities, meaning you want to rank higher in this one. You don't want to be lower.
Sure.
It says a lot. They were a bend but don't break defense. They
That's
they
exactly
were
what I was about to say. They're bend but don't break.
And
Yep.
just not getting enough stops, which people say, well, the offense needs to help the defense out. Help yourself.
Sure.
Get off the field more. Help yourself. And those are the fascinating stats that I look at with Notre Dame. And that's where a lot of the sacks and the tackles loss came from, is when they could condense the field, they were pretty good. And so to me, those are the areas where Notre Dame's got to get better. They can't be a team that's just great not giving up touchdowns, because you're playing better teams this year. Those teams are going to finish better in the end zone, not selling on field goals a lot. And so when you look at last year's defense, and this is kind of the stuff that we've talked about in the past. Now you talk about, this is now Marcus Freeman's team. This is now, he's got Al Golden as the defensive coordinator. Now it's like, okay, look at those areas of where your program has been and address them. Hiring a new coach doesn't just solve problems.
Sure.
Right? It's the new coach coming in and saying, where are the areas we got to get better? Let's make sure we recruit to fix those. Let's make sure that we prepare our players to be better in those areas. Maybe it means stronger. Maybe it means more athletic. Maybe it means quicker. Depending on what the issue is, it could mean a lot of different things. Maybe this guy needs to go from this position to that position because it's going to make him better. Making J.D. Bertrand go from Will to Mike, or if they ever got to a chance where they could maybe put Clarence Lewis from corner to safety at some point in time. I mean, there's all types of different things you can do. There's also schematic changes, but then more importantly, it's how do you prepare your team to be better in those fundamental areas on a day-to-day basis in winter, in spring, and summer, and then in fall camp. And those things have to be addressed. So if you don't recognize where you weren't good last year, then you're not going to take the steps to get better this year. And that's what we're going to learn about this Notre Dame defense is we're not saying they haven't done that. We're just saying, looking at this team, these are the areas that have to go out and get better. It's you can't just keep letting teams move up and down the field and not, we're great at holding the field goals. Here's a thought. How about you stop them way sooner, give your offense better field position? Because I think that's something that also hurt the Notre Dame team last year. So Notre Dame offense didn't get a ton of, hey, you got the ball at midfield opportunities. Hey, you got the ball at the plus 40 opportunities last year because you forced the team to punt from their own 5. And so those are the things you look at and say, that those are areas where this team is going to have to get better. And if they can make those improvements, Ryan, then that's when you start feeling like this team's got a chance to do something. Because Notre Dame was a team last year that ranked 14th and 19th in scoring defense and offense respectively. But they didn't finish in the top 30 on either side of the ball. Or actually, let me think about this if I can find it. I don't think they finished in the top 40 in on either side of the ball when it comes to. Yeah, Notre Dame finished 45th in total offense, 43rd in total defense. Yet they were top 20 in both scoring because they were good red zone teams on both sides of the ball. Right? I mean, you got to get better at creating those stops. And defensively, we are talking a lot about the offense needs to help the defense. I think the defense also needs to do a better job of helping the offense, which leads back to the original point of this conversation is, what does this team need to do to go from really good to elite? Because they're not there yet. And that is, to me, the defense has been really good. It's got to get better because it not only keeps points down, they then set up points for themselves. And I know last year there were spurts where that happened. Wisconsin, they get, a couple defensive scores. They got a couple defensive scores against Georgia Tech and all that. But those are fine. But I don't need those necessarily to beat Ohio State. It's more likely that what you need to do is what we saw Clemson do to Notre Dame early in 2015. And that was they pinned Notre Dame back. They gave their offense short fields. And even though the Clemson offense was pretty terrible in that game against Notre Dame in 2015, if you go back and look at the numbers, I mean, Notre Dame absolutely dominated the statistics of that game. The difference is that Clemson's defense gave their offense some really short fields because of turnovers. I mean, the special teams did as well. But Clemson's offense didn't have to go very far to score in 2015. They had a 40-yard touchdown drive, a 50-yard field goal drive, a 29-yard touchdown drive, and a 64-yard touchdown drive to start the game. So after that 64-yard touchdown drive, their next 2 touchdown drives combined for 69 yards. Well, that's the difference between winning and losing football games when you're playing a top team. And Notre Dame's touchdown drives were 80 and 64. Well, how did Notre Dame get the ball, or get a chance to win it late. I mean, the reason is because they finally got a short field, even though they had been outplayed the entire game. They were able to do some things where Notre Dame fumbled deep in their own territory. If you remember that, it was the play where Notre Dame was down 24-16, and they had driven down inside the 20, and they tried to do a shovel. They threw a pass to Chris Brown. He fumbled it inside the 5. You remember that?
Yeah.
Well, what happened on the next series is Notre Dame forced a 3 and out. Clemson punted. Notre Dame got a short field. That allowed Notre Dame to then go down and have the chance to tie it up. You need more drives like that in these big games. They tried to do that in 2018. I'll give the defense credit. They gave the offense some really good field position early in that game. Mm-hmm. They really did. And you just got to take better advantage. So to me, those are the things that I look at, Ryan, and say, if they can be more disruptive on early downs, that is going to be the thing that leads to more turnovers, better field position for the offense, more points for the offense. All those things kind of come together. Do that, and that's how you take that next step. That's how you play great team football, not just statistically you were here defensively, but you played great football. You not only shut down your opponent, you made your offense better. And I think that to me is the difference between a really good defense and an elite defense. And that's what Georgia does. That's what Clemson has done in the past when they were really good. That's what Alabama used to do back when defense was the primary driver of what they did. You do that stuff, you're going to have a chance to be a really good football team. And that's where the Notre Dame defense needs to get to.
There's one fascinating point that you made that I'm going to take back to something we've heard continuously from Marcus Freeman. You said Notre Dame was really good last year when they condensed the field. Mm-hmm. And one thing we've heard about Marcus Freeman continuously is we want to get longer and we want to get more athletic. Why? Because you make more plays. That's the end all be all, right? Yep. When there's more space, you can make more plays. When things get condensed, Notre Dame hasn't had any problems because there is lack of length and lack of athleticism at certain spots. There has been, at least, right? We think,
and you're saying training. It doesn't hurt you as much in the red zone because the 100%. Field is shorter, correct? Yes,
exactly. Yeah, well, you're dealing with less space, so that length and athleticism does not matter as much. That's why you'll see like the slower but like craftier route runners be end zone weapons. You'll see guys that can just win jump balls because the athleticism doesn't matter as much at that point. Its game is dictated less on space when the field is smaller. I mean, it's a pretty natural thing. So I think that's why you have continuously heard Marcus Freeman, even just as a defensive coordinator last year, we want to get longer. We want to get more athletic because we'll be able to make more plays in space. And that, at the end of the day, both sides of the ball, I think that's where Notre Dame needs to be better. Is they need to make more plays. And to your point, Brian, I mean, judging by those statistics of Notre Dame there's a lot more drives, longer drives against Notre Dame. And, maybe they're tightening up in the red zone. That tells me one big indicator of winning football games for me has always been time of possession. Usually when a team dominates time of possession, they're most likely on the positive outcome of winning a football game. More often than not, it's a very high percentage.
The exceptions are when you have teams like LSU who just score so quickly. So there's always exceptions to the rule. But again, that's what we're talking about. Notre Dame's offense isn't going to be that, in my opinion. It doesn't need to be that. It's a different animal. So I just want to say that because, there's going to be people that are going to come back with what I have said. I think time of possession gets overplayed way too much. Way too much. As if doing that ends in winning. What you're saying is I'll make sure I'm correct. What I believe you're saying is the opposite is true. When you do dominate, especially the way Notre Dame plays, it's going to result in you dominating time of possession.
Yes,
correct.
With in the style that Notre Dame is playing, if they are dominating the time of possession, I feel good about what the outcome is going to be. I'm telling you, if they go into Ohio State, and I know Ohio State can score quick, right? They have weapons to do it. But if Notre Dame dominates that time of possession in that game, I'm going to feel pretty good about what that outcome is because we know that Notre Dame, in order to win that game specifically, they want to grind it out a little bit, right? They want to keep those chains moving in their favor. They want to limit long drives. Those are the things that are big indicators with Notre Dame's style of winning football games. And it tells me last year, just judging, because I don't have what the time of possession differential was last year between Notre Dame and the opponents. I don't know what it is, but judging by just kind of how you explained the statistics, I would guess the time of possession was pretty split even, or maybe in the opponent's favor based upon the fact they seem to have a lot of long drives last year.
I'm going to find it right now.
Love it.
I'm going to answer your question. So if you look at time per game, Notre Dame, it was about 50-50. Notre Dame ranked 60th.
Yeah.
They had the ball for 29 minutes and 56 seconds, which means it was literally 4 seconds away from being literally split 50-50.
Yep.
When you play the style of football that Notre Dame plays, that's not necessarily an ideal thing.
Especially last year, where everything
Right.
felt like grinded out. Like you just were not. I mean, for the most part, I mean, again, we've talked about this a ton. Offensive line was not great, and running game was inconsistent because of that. So a lot of times, Notre Dame was playing behind the chains.
Right.
There was a lot of 2nd and 8s last year, like there were,
Right.
man. It's not an easy
Right.
thing to be in. So the fact that it's split tells me Notre Dame was not a super efficient offense last year, and they gave up a lot of long drives, and they tightened up in the red zone. Notre Dame's style, especially if they're closer to last year stylistically, because we know Notre Dame wants to run the football. Like they're not just going to be a air raid and throw the ball around, run and gun, like all that type of stuff, right? Like they are going to try to dictate the pace of a football game, a little bit of a slower pace, in my opinion, right?
Mm-hmm.
For the most part. So in that style, you have to dominate the time of possession. If it's split even, that tells me there's either inefficiency on offense or you're giving up long drives, or
the exception being that Notre Dame rips off big plays. I mean, obviously that's the exception, right? I mean, because like the first thing I think of, when you're making the argument is because this is one of the fascinating stats that I saw last year, which was when I watched the Ohio State Michigan game last year, it felt like Ohio State or Michigan dominated the time of possession, and I felt that way with Oregon too. But in both of those games, Ohio State had the ball more than those two teams in both games. Part of the reason is because those teams scored quickly and Ohio State was going on long drives and different things like that. But, like you look at the Oregon game, for example, CJ Verdell had a 77-yard touchdown. That led to it. And then, of course, against Michigan, they had some big plays as well. They had some short fields. I mean, so there's always caveats to it. But the point Ryan is making is you've got to be able to control the line of scrimmage. And to me, it's a lot easier to do that offensively when your defense is giving you the ball in great positions. That's the key. It's also a lot easier to do that when your defense is getting stops early and allows your offense to kind of jump ahead. I think those are the things. So for Notre Dame specifically, I do think that in the Ohio State matchup specifically, I do agree with you to a degree, Ryan, that the time of possession is going to be important, especially early in the game. But at the end of the day, it's about make early down stops. And if Notre Dame can do that against Ohio State, against anybody, they're going to be good. They're going to be really good, and that's going to be the key. And then, of course,
go
ahead.
Sorry, I was just going to say my two biggest things that I want to see is minimalize impact. I said that already, right? Like I want the offense to be at a lower level than it typically is on a game-to-game basis. Like you're not going to shut out Ohio State, right? You're not going to hold them to 7 points. But if a team is scoring 40 points usually, let's hold them to high 20s, right? Like that's kind of minimalize the impact. And the other big thing for me is create mistakes, right? And how do you create mistakes? Force running backs into bad decisions, force quarterbacks into bad decisions, leading to some bad plays. We talked about the importance of I'm going to keep going back to the Ohio State game because that's the first game we're going to see, forcing CJ Stroud into bad decision-making opportunities. Sacks are going to be important, sure, but like also bad throws, right? Trap coverages because you have to rush a process, do those types of things. So I think that's like the two biggest thing for me: minimalize impact of the best players on a given offense and create mistakes. If you do those two things, I think Notre Dame is going to be in a good spot. But it's very important to do both.
Yep. I think the thing for me too, Ryan, is like if you look at some of the bigger games this year, the one thing they cannot do is they cannot allow programs like USC and Ohio State and Clemson to allow their quarterbacks to gash them. Especially Ohio State. And again, that's where the finish. So again, circling back, that's where the finishing part comes from. How do you get those quarterbacks in there? So when they run on first down, or it's 3rd and 4, or 3rd and 6, or 3rd and 7, or whatever, and you lose gap discipline, you can't get off a block, whatever the case may be, and the quarterback runs for first down. If Ohio State's quarterback's able to do that, he didn't do a ton last year, but I feel like Ohio State's going to put him. If you ever go back and watch his high school film, you realize there's a level of running ability in CJ Stroud we didn't see last year. That I think we'll see now that he's in year 2. They can't allow that to happen. Same with Caleb Williams. The same with DJ when they play him, or if it's Cade Klubnik by that point in time. Same with Jaron Hall, BYU. Every single team that they play this year, to a degree, has a quarterback that can do a little something with his legs. Clemson's at the bottom of that list of those 4.
From Boston
Jurkovic's another great one. Yeah. Yes, Clemson or UNC is going to have a quarterback that can run.
That's Syracuse definitely has one.
Just can't throw. But
Nobody's
At least he
perfect,
couldn't
Ryan.
last year. At least he couldn't
Yeah.
last year.
Yeah.
But the point is that's where finishing comes from, Ryan, right?
Mhm.
It's Bill Walsh is going off on this long list in the chat about quarterback runs, and that's what we've been saying all offseason. Like, quarterbacks have killed Notre Dame, and he's absolutely right. Like, you can't allow in those games to have, your starting quarterback who's not really a runner going for 100 yards because and it's not even on designed runs. It's on stuff where you're giving up scrambles where you were about to get off the field and then you couldn't.
Yeah.
And if you just were good on if they finished against North Carolina last year at the quarterback, they beat North Carolina by 30.
100%.
If they were good at finishing on the quarterback last year against Oklahoma State, that game's never close. It's never close.
No.
And that's the thing, is like, it's right there for the taking. You've got to now make those plays. And that's not an offensive problem. You can't blame the offense run blocking, can't blame the offense receivers not being able to get off press for that. Right? That's on the defense. And that's got to be fixed.
That's where I think Maris Loifau really comes in this year, being able to be that athletic dude on the second level that can kind of close on some of those quarterback breakdowns, right? Like kind of those scrambles. I think that's where, because and this is all due respect, JD Bertrand did a really good job for filling in when he wasn't projected to be a starter last year, right? Drew White was a good football player for multiple years at Notre Dame, but that lack of length and athleticism that I just talked about a little bit ago is prevalent in both of those guys, right? So I think that that's where the quarterback scramble stuff comes into effect. You need guys on the second level that have that combination of athleticism and length. So I think Maris Loifau is especially going to be a huge guy this season to stop some of that quarterback, not quarterback run game, quarterback scramble game, stuff out of structure. I think that Notre Dame needs to be more athletic on the second level and more disruptive in the front 3 to 4. Like they need that type of production this year.
Yep. Now, I think you kind of segued it nicely there to the second part of it, which is the linebackers. The linebackers are a part of this. If the defensive line is going to be more disruptive, you're going to see a jump in tackle for loss production from the line for sure. And a perfect example, Will Anderson last year, like he had an absurd stat line, 17 and a half sacks, but he had 33 and a half tackles for loss, which means he had 16 run game stops.
Crazy.
And that's an abnormal thing. And I'm not going to sit there and be like, Isaiah Foskey needs to have, 12 sacks and 25 tackles for loss this year. I'm not saying that, but give me 5. Right? Jason Adamiola, I don't need you to have, I don't need you to be Aaron Donald. I need you to give me like 9 or 10. You know what I mean? Like I don't need Riley Mills to go out there this year and have 18 tackles for loss. But I need 9 or 10.
Right.
Those are the things. Or even if you want us to go big end production overall, I need 14, 15, right? Like those things I need. But where the numbers are going to take a huge jump and need to take a huge jump is at linebacker. Notre Dame's linebacker production last year against the run was, if we're being honest, it was abysmal. It really was. The run game tackle for loss production last year, I'm looking at it now. It was, that's 15 and a half. Go down here, 18 and a half, 19 and a half tackles for loss last year from the entire linebacking core. Jeremiah Wusu-Koramoah and Drew White alone had 20 the year before. Alone. And if you look at it, it's 24 and a half, it's 27 and a half, it's 29, it's 30. 30 the year before in 12 games.
Wow.
Right? Those are the things you look at and say, boy, that's got to get a whole lot better. The year before, Asmar Bilal and Drew White combined for 18. Let's see, 22, 23 and a half, 25 and a half. He had 25 and a half in 2019 in a year where I didn't think the linebackers played great. So the linebacker production has to get a lot better against the run. That's where the run stops. The tackles for loss need to be where the D-line just blows things up. The linebackers come and Jason Adamiola gets free. He comes off the block. He makes the running back cut back soon, and bam, right there, the Mike linebackers are there, drill the guy in the backfield. That's why we talk about complementary football. It's not just offensive versus defense. It's also within units. If the defensive line is being more disruptive, Ryan, then it also is important that not only they finish, but then the linebackers got to finish. There's times when you're using your defensive line to get a run through free. That's what we saw against Oklahoma State. We talked that series. They ran a stunt. that allowed J.D. Bertrand to get a clean shot on the quarterback. It's a great call. And then you just miss.
Mm-hmm.
And so it can't just be the D-line. The D-line could do their job and do it very well, but if the linebackers don't make more plays at the ball, then it won't matter. It won't have as big of an impact as if it's just the D-line, right? Or, and the linebackers. Like, it's got to be both. And that, to me, is the big thing, is the linebackers have to take a big jump in production this year. They have to be far more effective on ball. Now, the thing I'm confident about is last year you had your defensive coordinator was your linebackers coach, which is the same this year. You had Nick Lazinski there. Nick was a good football coach. I'm happy for him. Great guy. He's at Vanderbilt now. But it wasn't necessarily an ideal situation in a lot of different ways for a lot of different reasons. There was a lot of things going on there that don't really care to get into. But this year, you're in a situation where your defensive coordinator is still your linebackers coach. But you've got James Laurinaitis there, and you have Marcus Freeman there, and you have other people on staff that are going to be a factor in the linebacker coaching. So there's going to be a lot more attention to that unit this year than there was last year, where it was injuries. I mean, you lost your starting Will right before the season. Yep. Other guys kind of faded, like Shane Simon went into the tank after being a starter the year before, and he wasn't very good the year before, but he was still played. You had a lot of J.D. Bertrand was banged up most of the year. There's just a lot going on. You're replacing an All-American. Now you're in a situation where everybody comes back, and you get, including Marist. There's no excuse not to be a lot better this year, and they have to be. If that unit, to me, might be the biggest difference between this being a really good defense and an elite defense. And we'll talk about the secondary tomorrow, and we'll have some conversations about that. But I have seen teams with decent secondaries have great defenses before, because their front seven was just incredibly disruptive, to where the secondary could just kind of keep everything in front of them and rally to the ball, step in front of some. The 2018 defense was a lot like that. Part of what made that secondary so good was they could just they were real smart, and they could keep everything in front of them. And so Julian Love could bait you into think of the pick that trying to remember the kid's name from NC State, Ryan, what was the quarterback's name? Ryan Finley, a couple years ago. He gets pressured. He rushes off a throw. Julian Love backpedals, baits him into throwing that ball, steps in front of it, and picks it off. He did the same thing to the Michigan State quarterback. It was Lewerke, right? Wasn't that the quarterback in 2017? He did the same thing to him on that pick six that he had against them. Because he was so worried about the pass rush that it's like, okay, quick game, I got to get this thing off quick. Julian Love was able to stay off, let him kind of get into where he was thinking, hey, I got this, and then bam, he jumps it and picks it off. Right? Well, you can only do that if your pass rush is getting to you, because otherwise, if they're not getting a pass rush, he's just going to sit back there and pick you apart. He'll nickel and dime you all day, go right down the field, and once he gets that one shot, the quarterback goes over the top, and bam, there you got it. But if you're able to get consistent pressure in the front seven, it makes your secondary better. If your safeties are run fitting off of things where the running back's now making a cut off of your linebacker, now all of a sudden DJ Brown is there to drill him because the guy's not able to make a move on DJ. Why? Because he's already made his move off the disruptive linebacker. That's when run fits work best, is when you can square up a DB in space. That DB a lot of times is going to have some problems, right? Mm-hmm. You're gonna beat guys because you're able to sort of get an angle and kind of ride them to the sideline or ride them to your help, or you're tackling them after they've made a cut or a move off of somebody else, right? And so that's the key. That's why we talk about that second man in. So like when J.D. Bertrand had that pressure against Spencer Sanders and he had to step away, that's when he was most vulnerable to get brought down. But there wasn't a second guy there. Right. And that's the difference, Ryan. So the secondary will be better if the front seven is elite. It will be a lot better, even if they don't improve. Be a lot better if the front seven is elite, and if the front seven can put them in situations where it is 3rd and 11 and 3rd and 12. And you don't have to put Clarence Lewis in a press man situation because you got to get an extra guy in the box to defend a 3rd and 4, right? You can let Clarence play off and say, hey, complete a 7-yard hitch route. That's cool. It's 3rd and 10. I'm going to tackle you, because what does Clarence Lewis usually do pretty well? Tackling in space on quick throws, right? And so those are the situations why it's so important for this front seven to be elite. And for the linebackers, or for the defensive line, it's just, you're pretty good, just be even better. Mm-hmm. For the linebackers, however, it's going to require a big jump from what they were last year. The thing is, though, Ryan, it's not asking any of them to do something that they're not capable of doing. That's the thing, right?
I think they're in better positions to maximize what they do best. I mean, we've talked a lot about JD Bertrand is just a better fit at Mike linebacker than playing Will, because you don't want him playing in a ton of space. You want him being the lead man and coming downhill and doing all those types of things. And I jumped the gun with the Maris Loifout thing because, again, talked about Marcus Freeman's kind of like talk about the recruiting thing for a second, right? In the last 2 years, Notre Dame has signed 7 extremely talented and athletic linebackers for the most part. Now, different degrees of variety as far as the athleticism component, but at least all of them have some form of athleticism, length, or both, right? And so we have seen that there is an emphasis on getting longer and more athletic, especially on the second level. So why are so many people excited about Maris Loifout for Notre Dame being healthy this year, including myself? It's because you know that it's been a problem. Like, right. Again, I liked Drew White, man. He was a good football player. I think he got a lot out of his ability. I really do. I mean, was he a 3-year starter for being a guy that's 6 foot, 220 something pounds with 29-inch arms?
On some pretty good defenses, right?
Absolutely. Yeah. Like Drew White is going to be a celebrated player, in my opinion, in Notre Dame, because he got, I think, just about as much as he could out of his athletic ability. Like, he was a good football player at Notre Dame.
He started on defenses that ranked 6th, 11th, and 24th in defensive efficiency. That's pretty good. That's pretty good.
Absolutely. But the point of the matter is why we're doing this podcast specifically. It's because it still needs to get better, right? Like, there's still a level up that needs to happen. And we know that Maris Loifout, while he may not be perfect at times, he brings a different level of athleticism and length that you did not have on the second level last year for Notre Dame. Right. That's what you're looking for. That's why they're recruiting guys like Jalen Sneed and Nolan Ziegler and Joshua Burnham, even though now he's playing Viper for your defense. That's why they're looking at guys like Drake Bowen and Jay Nosberry and Preston Zinter, because they bring some form of length or explosiveness or both to the table. So that is an emphasis, and I think it will be better. I have high expectations for the linebacker unit. How much better will it be? That's a great question. But I think if Maris Loifout is healthy this year and JD Bertrand profiles to Mike as good as I think he can be, I think it's going to be a very, very improved group. And that's not even mentioning Jack Kaiser playing Rover, where he's played a year of football, right? Like, he's going to get smarter and more instinctive from that position, and which should let his athleticism kind of come out a little bit more than maybe it did last season at times. So I think that there's big upside to this group, but at the end of the day, Brian, we've talked about this endlessly over the last few weeks. You got to do it, right? Like, it's got to happen. But I think that there are the tools to make it happen. But to the biggest point here is that linebacker play has been steady to good and spurts over the last couple of years, but it needs to be at a much higher level. You can't have 18 and a half tackles for loss this year. You need to be a play-making group.
The thing is, too, Ryan, is I think the linebacker play has benefited in recent years from having a great player. And I think that's the thing that needs to get better this year, is you've had a great player. Jeremiah Wusu was a great player with other solid players, right? And this unit, to me, needs to be as a whole better as a whole. And I think that's what's been missing at Notre Dame for a long time, is we haven't seen great linebacking cores at Notre Dame. We've seen good ones. We've seen great individual linebackers. I mean, great individual linebackers. But those great individual linebackers, I mean, Manti, Danny Spahn was a really solid player. Dan Fox was a real solid player. They weren't studs, right? I mean, and that's the thing that's been missing a lot of times. It's Jeremiah Wusu is a great player, but the other guys are just solid. That's what made the 2018 defense so good, because the 2 inside linebackers were both really good.
Studs,
Neither of them were as good as Jeremiah Wusu-Koramoah or Jalen Smith or Manti. But as a duo, I would argue that's the best combination Notre Dame had at linebacker, even though neither Drew White, Drew Tranquil, or Tavon Coney were on the level of Jeremiah Wusu-Koramoah or Jalen or Manti, because the two of them were excellent. Yeah. And that's the thing that we need to see this year is, can both inside linebackers be good? Can Jack Kaiser be a better guy in space against the run and quick pass? Those are the things we need to see. And because here's the deal. You and I were talking before the show, and Isaiah Foskey, to me, the one thing that this coaching staff needs to do is give him more opportunities to make plays. We came across some fascinating stats when we were prepping for the show. So if you look at Pro Football Focus and you just take the number of run snaps and pass snaps and then production from Isaiah Foskey. Isaiah Foskey last year had a hit or sack on the quarterback on 5.3% of his pass rush snaps. Will Anderson last year had a hit or sack on the quarterback on 5.4% of his pass snaps last year. What was the difference in numbers, Ryan? Because his numbers were way better. It was opportunity.
Yeah.
He had 330 pass rushes. Isaiah Foskey had 210. Well, part of that was because Isaiah Foskey dropped in coverage a lot more. He dropped in coverage 12 times more than Will Anderson last year because he played in fewer games, but he also played 564 snaps compared to 873 from Will Anderson. Use him more and let him attack more. Run game, same deal. In 200 so if you look at Isaiah Foskey last year, if you look at his number of run stops, a run stop is like, at or behind the line of scrimmage, short of the first down, things like that. Isaiah Foskey last year had 35 run stops on 210. I'm sorry, he had 284 pass rushes last year, excuse me. But if you look at his number of his run stops, he had 35 run stops on 210 run snaps, right? That's a 16.7% per snap average. Like 16, that's really good. Will Anderson last year, who we talked about, had 15.9%. Now, Will Anderson had 53 run stops last year compared to Foskey's 35. But what was the difference? Foskey played in 210 snaps on run defense, and Will Anderson played on 333. The pass rush snaps were, I gave the wrong ones. I said 333 to 2. It was actually, Will Anderson was on 482 pass rushes last year to Isaiah Foskey's 284. I gave the run and pass backwards. So much higher rate percentage on the run stuff, about identical in pass rush. Mm-hmm. So the difference was volume.
Yes.
Right. And so Foskey just needs to keep doing what he's doing and just have that normal junior to senior growth. He doesn't need to play beyond what he's already shown, in my opinion, even if he just stagnant. And you've said this before the summer. Yes, there are areas where he can get better, but if he just stays the same, he's an All-American, in my opinion, if they use him enough. Right. The difference is the other guys have to step up and do these things. It's Jason Adamiola taking his game to another level. It's same thing for his brother. It's Howard Cross being able to take his per snap production last year and expand it on with more snaps. So if you look at Howard Cross last year, in games where he played the most snaps, he was the least productive. When he was playing fewer snaps, he was more productive. That can't be the case this year because he's going to be playing more snaps. Sure. And Jacob Lacey's got to step up and make plays. Riley Mills has to be that guy. He has to be that guy, along with Alexander Ahrensberger. I had a source reach out to me the other day and say, hey, Nana's had a really good camp. Good. Right? That trio of guys, and again, Riley's the starter, but they're going to need Nana to play well. They're going to need Ahrensberger to play well, inside and outside. They're going to need that trio, Ryan, to be a run-stopping force on the edge. They're going to need 15, 16 tackles for loss from that position group compared to what it had last year. I mean, last year, the production just wasn't there, Ryan. I mean, when you look at it, the production just wasn't there. I mean, and look, Myron Tungvaloa, great kid, solid edge player for them last year. I'm not beefing so much about what kind of player he was, but just that position as a whole just wasn't super productive. I mean, I'm looking at it now. They had 5, 8, 10, 11 and a half tackles for loss last year total from the defensive end group. Mm-hmm. Well, I mean, we've seen years where the starter was about that. I mean, Khalid Kareem had 10 in 2000. That was the big
end, right?
Yeah, big end. Yeah. Khalid Kareem had 10 and a half by himself, 1 year. You had 13 and a half just from the two of them, the top two guys. That doesn't include the whole depth chart. So you're going to need minimum 15 tackles for loss from that position group this year, in my opinion. So it's got to be the other guys to step up, right? It can't be if Foskey goes out and have some Herculean season. That's not going to make this defense what it needs to be. He needs to keep doing what he's doing. And, of course, if he gets more opportunity, his numbers will look better if he gets more opportunities. But it doesn't necessarily mean he's impacting the game more on a per-snap basis. He's just playing more. It's the other guys that got to step up, which is kind of funny. I was actually watching that movie the other night, which is just sometimes I need to laugh at stupid things. I'll pop that movie in. And then the linebacker production's got to get better. That's where the jumps have got to happen. And those are the question marks. Can Jason Adamiola make that jump? You don't often see guys as fifth-year seniors make giant leaps like that. We've seen it before. Zach Martin went from a good player in 2012 to a top 20 draft pick in 2013.
Sure.
Right. And we've seen Asmar Bilal went from a guy that you're like, that guy cannot be on the field, to a pretty good linebacker as in his last year. So we've seen it, especially when there's coaching changes, but it's got to happen. It got to take it to another level.
And Jason specifically is only he's only a 1 year starter, right? Like he's played he's played football at Notre Dame, but like last year was his first heavy volume of snaps, right? So I think there could be projection and production, impact.
But that's why the finishing thing is so important with him, Ryan.
Yes.
And this is what you wrote about. Like this dude, if you watch his film, you're like, this guy is crushing people.
A good player, yeah.
I mean, he's just getting off blocks. His block destruction is great, but it's like, but why isn't his production better?
Sure.
And that's the thing.
At the end of the day, this is kind of quantified by like a very basic analysis here, right? But I wrote an article to your points about that. I think Jason Adamalola needs more respect from a national perspective. I think most Notre Dame fans appreciate what Jason Adamalola is, but not national does not. Well, Jason, what's the one way to change that narrative? Produce, man.
Right.
Do it. Right? I mean, at the end of the day, do it. And the narrative will change very quickly, in my opinion. The Notre Dame defensive line in general, like right now, from a national perspective, people have heard, Riley Mills break out and Jason Adamalola is a good player. But from a national perspective, they're looking at this defensive line right now and they're saying that's Isaiah Foskey and a a bunch of guys. Right. That's what they're saying right now. That's the point.
Bruce Feldman, somebody sent me a text he made, or like text of a comment he made on some other podcast. And he was like talking about Ohio State versus Notre Dame. He's like, Michael Mayer and maybe a couple linemen would start at Ohio State. And he's like, Isaiah Foskey and like maybe another guy start on Ohio State's defense. Now, beyond the fact that a national reporter is that oblivious to Notre Dame's talent is a different conversation.
Sure.
But the fact is like, but there's a reason that perception exists. If Jason Adamiola's got 10 tackles for loss last year and the production he should have had based on his disruption, then we're not having this conversation. The narrative is different. You want to, that's the thing. There was we were talking about the other day, we're talking about like sports movies inspire you. And it was on the show Sean and I did together. And it was the quote that I used was from the movie Miracle. Now, again, I don't know if Herb Brooks really said this in real life, but the quote in the movie was, he basically like said that tonight's your night. He's like, you have this big opportunity in front of you. Now go take it.
Yes.
Right. And that's my thing to Jason Adamiola, Justin Adamiola, Riley Mills. If you don't like being disrespected, then do something about it. Right.
Sure.
Produce. Make big plays in Columbus. Make big plays against Clemson. Make big plays against USC if USC's good, right? And those are the things. Nobody cares that you made a big play against Wisconsin. Where was that big play against Cincinnati? And that's why a lot of reason why Foskey is viewed differently. It's the production, number one, but you can also find some big plays and big moments from Foskey. He can't be the only guy because it was basically like if Foskey didn't step up and make a play, it wasn't getting made last year in a lot of instances. That's got to be the key. And I think he's going to do it, Ryan. And I know that you are. I mean, I used to think I was the only one like on the bus of the Jason Adamiola like hype train. You've now actually pushed me out of the driver's seat and put me into the passenger seat. You know what I mean? But there's a reason for it. It's because you're a film guy. You watch the film, you're like, this guy is like unblockable at times.
Yes.
But he's got to finish better. And I think once that happens, the disrespect goes away. Because like that's what I loved about that quote. In that hype up video that I made for IB members. It's on the IB board only. If you got to be a member to watch, it's kind of fun to do. And it was a quote that we played in the show with Sean Davis a couple weeks ago was, it's like Lou Holtz's thing is like, if you don't want to be disrespected, then go do something about it. You know what I mean? Like, and that's where Notre Dame is at. That's where Jason Adamiola is. Hey man, you're disrespected. Good. Use it as tackling fuel. You know what I mean? Like go do something about it. And that's what kind of gets you excited, Ryan. Like, hey, Maris Luafau, nobody's talking about you. Okay, cool. Here's why. Go do something about it. And that's the key. That's what you get excited about. So I think they're capable of.
What I'm really excited about, and this is specifically about Jason for a second, is that some guys talk more about talk than action, right? So you don't think Jason Adamalola sees the disrespect on Twitter with like these rankings and this big
I know he
boomer
does.
And all this type of stuff.
I know he does.
But the thing that gives me a lot of hope for him having that type of season because I don't see him retweeting stuff and saying like, this is disrespectful, stupid list, all this type of stuff, right? It's about the action, man. Like at the end of the day, Jason, I think you're a great football player. I do, man. I think you could be one of the best defensive tackles in college football this year. But at the end of the day, to change that narrative, to really make me sound like I'm smart, you got to do it on the field, man. Because I'll tell you this, I don't sound smart all the time. So I would love Jason Amalola to rack up 15 tackles for loss this year and be like, oh, Ryan Roberts knows what he's talking about. That's very
If you're as right about Jason Adamiola as Vince was last year about Cam Hart, this defense is going to be really good.
Yeah.
I mean, it's going to be really good because it starts up front, man. That's the whole thing. This thing starts up front. Now Riley Mills' job is made easier. Howard Cross's job is made easier because we know they're sliding their protection to Jason and Isaiah every time because they can't block them.
Well, the national perspective, though, that it's Isaiah Foskey and everybody else works into those guys' favor too, because early on, all the eyes are going to be on number 7. Number 7 can't stop us. Right. Well, I think that number 57 has the ability to make a lot of plays off of that. I think number 99 has the abilities to make plays off of that. I think 56 has the opportunities to make plays off of that. I think there's a lot of guys in this defensive line that can make plays, but at the end of the day, there's a lot of talent, but it needs to become tangible production at this point. Yep. And if it does, this defense has a chance to be very good because you just mentioned Cam Hart. Cam Hart was good last year. You know how much better Cam Hart's going to be if the defensive line is as good as we think it can be, forcing pressures, forcing bad decisions, mistakes, and him being able to capitalize on it. Sky is the limit if this defensive line and this linebacker unit play really well up front. And I think they can, but at the end of the day, to eliminate these narratives, you have to play ball and you have to play at a high level.
Yeah. And somebody said, Cricky says, Brian, just for context, he actually did say the words, now go out there and take it.
Yes.
Right. And that's the thing is like, that's what they got to do. Look, and I'm working on an article right now and I'm almost done with it, but it's kind of in response to, Paul Feinbaum. And it's not really a response in that I'm tearing down his argument. I kind of make a point that it was lazy. It was just like it was more for hot take than it was like providing real analysis. But the point is there's a reason that this is allowed to exist. And the reason it's allowed to exist, despite the fact that it's just lazy and incorrect, factually incorrect, is because Notre Dame has allowed this narrative to grow because of the fact that it doesn't step up in those big games.
100%.
Right. And so like, if you don't like it, do something about it. Right. And
well, it's like, did you see Barrett? Is it pronounced Salee?
Yeah, it was a great, yeah. I retweeted. It was a great. It was it took 2 minutes for him to find that out.
Yeah, I mean, like it's a good point, but at the end of the day, in order for that to continue to trend in the right direction, right? Like they need to win the big game. Like that as soon as how does a narrative stop? By eliminating it, right? It's not like you slowly trickle down, like, oh wow, moral victory. We almost beat Ohio State. No, the minute that you beat that team, that's when those narratives stop. Clemsoning, to your point, Brian, was once a thing, right? Clemsoning stopped because at a point, Clemson under Deshaun Watson and then under Trevor Lawrence started winning those games. They started not letting their program down and making I don't want to say a laughing stock because they were still a pretty good program, but like Clemsoning was a thing that you said to make fun of people. In order to stop narratives, you need to eliminate them, not just fight back against them. Eliminate them.
And beating Clemson in double overtime without their starting quarterback is not a silencer, especially when you go out 3 weeks later and get curb stomped by that same team with their starting quarterback.
If anything, that improved the narrative on the other side of it, in my opinion. Because it's like
it solidified it. See, they're not there because they only beat them because they were missing Mike Jones and Tyler Davis and all those other kind of guys. So that's the big thing is for Notre Dame, and there's nothing we as fans can do about it, right? I mean, it's going to be up to Marcus Freeman and his staff and his players to say, hey, look, you don't like this narrative, you don't like the disrespect, do something about it. And that's the key. And people say, wow, 16 and a half, that's a disrespectful. It is disrespectful. But why is it keep growing? Because people are still betting on Ohio State. Why? Because they look at every big game that Notre Dame has played and they're like, 16 isn't enough. Right? I mean, think about it. Cotton Bowl 2 years ago. Right? Well, the only one would be Cincinnati last year, 11. Right? I mean, Oklahoma State, it's kind of a big game, but it's Oklahoma State with all due. I don't mean that disrespectfully, but it's Oklahoma State, right?
Yeah.
But you go Cincinnati 11. Year before that, it's the Cotton Bowl against Alabama, 17. That was with Notre Dame scoring late.
Yep.
ACC championship game, 24. right? You go back to 2018, 27-point loss to Clemson. 2019, 31-point loss to Michigan. 2017, you had a was like a 18-point loss to Stanford at the end of the season. 33-point loss to Miami. The only exception to this rule has been the Georgia games, really. And that's because Georgia plays a style of football that they just don't blow it up. I mean, they just don't blow. They at that time they weren't blowing teams out, and Notre Dame has the athletes to hang with them and compete with them in those situations. So that's the thing you look at, Ryan, is like when you compare this team, is like, I understand why people have the spreads the way they have them. I get it, right? I get it. I think it's disrespectful and all that, but I understand it. If Notre Dame was out, like if Notre Dame still lost to Clemson in 2018 and Georgia in 2019, well, let me rephrase this. If Notre Dame lost to Miami in 2017 and Clemson in 2018 and Michigan in 2019 and Clemson in the ACC title game and Alabama in the Rose Bowl and then Cincinnati last year, if they still lost every single one of those games, but those games looked like Georgia 2017 or Georgia 2019 or Florida State 2014, if the outcome and the way the game transpired for 4 quarters looked more like the Florida State game, the 2 Georgia games, then the narrative is different. The narrative is the way that it is because Notre Dame has gone out and gotten blown out in those games. And so that's the whole point is, you've given yourself this reputation because of how you've performed. And Ryan, the point I was making when you had to step out is it's not just losing games. If every one of the big losses that I talked about, Miami 17, Clemson 18, if all of them looked like the Georgia games or like 2014 Florida State, the narrative is different.
Yeah, it'd be
because they're
like
competitive.
You're close, right? Like you're getting there. You're heading in the right direction.
It's like how people talked about when Clemson lost to Alabama. They lost in the title game, but it was celebrated like, wow, they were close. Like Alabama had to do this, an onside kick, and do this and do that. And look what Clemson's done. Instead of going out there and getting beat 45-20 or 45-17. And so at the end of the day, that's the reality of it, right? Is you've got to be able to step up and say, if you don't like the narrative, then change it. Because they're not going to change it because they feel bad that they keep bashing you. Oh, you know what? I feel really bad for being critical of Notre Dame. I feel bad. I'm going to go change my tune. No, the only way you're going to change your tune is by making them change your tune. And that's the opportunity that Notre Dame has. I mean, this is a really unique opportunity this year for Notre Dame as we wrap this part of the show up, in that you do have an Ohio State road game on your docket. You do have Clemson coming to your home stadium. You do have, everybody's golden boy, Lincoln Riley, going out there at USC. And then, whatever your post-game opportunities are, there are big game opportunities for Notre Dame this year to shut people up. And if you want to shut them up, then you got to do it in defensively, wrapping it up. It's going to be about the front seven. They have to be elite if the rest of the defense is going to be elite. The people are there. The players are in place. The talent is there. Riley Mills is a highly ranked player. Isaiah Foskey is going to be a first-round pick. Jason Adamiola was a top 100 recruit. Maris Luafau is a really talented player. I mean, there's dudes there, right? It's just go out there and show it. And that's going to be the key for Notre Dame this year.
I haven't coached in a couple of years, Brian, but I feel like we just went into full pregame coach mode, man. You got to go out and you got to take it. What are you guys talking about right now, man?
Well,
I love it.
Here's the response. Like Josh Phillips says, fair analysis, Notre Dame choking in big games, but let's not forget Ohio State has laid some eggs against teams they were supposed to beat as well. And fair point, Purdue, Iowa, they got blown out by Alabama, but that blowout against Alabama came after they had blown out Clemson in the semifinal. Yeah. Right? Yes, they lost to Purdue and Iowa in bad games, but you know what else they did? They won a national championship by beating Alabama and then Oregon. Right? I mean, they went to the playoff against Clemson and took Clemson down to the wire and had a shot to win it at the end in the playoff. That's the difference. Is they've had a couple bad losses, but you can excuse. And again, this is Josh. Your point is not wrong. I mean, I'm not saying that you're wrong, but what I'm saying is the reason that the same perception doesn't exist for them. And again, last time they played in the college football playoff, they got destroyed by Alabama. But they also have a win over Alabama in the playoff era.
Yep.
Right. They have a win over Clemson in the playoff era, right? They have won a national championship in the playoff era. When you win those games, you're going to get the benefit of the doubt when you lose them. For example, Alabama has had a couple really embarrassing big game blowouts, right? They got toasted by Clemson in the 2018 championship game. But why wasn't Nick Saban treated like Brian Kelly? Because he's won more of those games than he's lost, right? I mean, Nick Saban's had some bad losses too, but those games get kind of excused a little bit when, okay, yeah, we played like crap against Texas A&M, but we came back and stomped, curb stomped Georgia in the SEC title game. Notre Dame doesn't have those games to point to. Brian Kelly's, think about this. Brian Kelly's claim to fame as a head coach at Notre Dame is almost beating Florida State and not losing to Alabama and Clemson, the year they won championships, by as much as the other teams they played in the playoff. Think about that. So yeah, that's why that thing exists. And that's
and it should exist. I mean,
right.
This is the end of the my rant for a second here, Brian. But like, I'm a Notre Dame fan, but I'm also going to take my fan hat off for a second and say, like, it's not good enough, though. I mean, like, at the end of the day, there's been, sure, you can find some parts to the fight back, to the pushback of the conversation, but Notre Dame hasn't been good enough. It's right. I mean, that's just all. That's the point.
And that's the task for Marcus Freeman, right? Sure. I mean, that's the task. Yep. Prove it wrong. Like
there's only one person that can. There's only one There's only one side that can change the narrative, and that is your side. At the end of
the Notre Dame players and coaches.
Yes.
That's it. I can't. I can make all the brilliant arguments you want. I can spin things into Bama lost this game and Ohio State won that game, and I can do all the spin I need to do. But that's not my job. I'm not Notre Dame's hype man, right? Mm-hmm. It's you got to do it. You got to earn it. And that's the exciting thing. And honestly, that's where my optimism comes from. Will it be Ohio State in the opener? I don't know. We'll find out. But I do believe it's going to come. Yes. And the next 2-3 seasons give Notre Dame a lot of opportunity. The schedule gives Notre Dame a lot of opportunities the next few years to do that. Mm-hmm. And now they got to go seize it. So we're not done yet. We are done with this portion of the show, Ryan, but we are not completely done because we are going to have a mailbag. I'm sure we're going to continue this part of the conversation as we get into the mailbag. But we are going to dive into that next. But before we go, I would really appreciate it if you all would hit that like button right there, hit the subscribe button, hit the notification bell, share this podcast, and of course, sign up for the Irish Breakdown message board. It's trust me, it's worth it. It's definitely worth it. So, Ryan, let's transition into the mailbag today. We do have some good questions. We have some super chats here. We have one from Bill Kostrup. It says, if we get burnt by another long shovel pass again, I will absolutely lose my stuff. And yes, yeah, there's that. That's been the thing that's been kind of maddening about Notre Dame in recent years is like some of the big plays they've given up are just like, what are you doing?
Fluky. Yeah.
Yeah. Or not even fluky, but just like, dude, you no. That's not even them being better than you. Like Devontae Smith torching them, he was just better than anybody that had. Sure. There was, they outplayed Notre Dame in the Fiesta Bowl last year. They did. It wasn't fluky. They just outplayed them. But a lot of the stuff is like, what? Like, what? Come on. Pick sixes again. You put your backup quarterback, your starting quarterback's coming off the best game of his career in 2017 against Wake Forest. In the first half, things aren't going great, and you bench him for a redshirt sophomore who was like mediocre at best, I'd say below average in his only start that season. And then you're shocked when he throws a pick six. Hey, that ain't Ian Book's fault.
Right.
That's your fault. You know what I mean? As a coach, some of the stuff is like, the fumble against Clemson, like, some of the stuff they did, like, that wasn't Clemson making a play. That was you being dumb or you blowing a coverage and that's the thing that I want to get rid of is if somebody's going to beat you, Ryan, make them beat you.
Sure. Well, it was like that. I was at the Cincinnati game last year where they hit that seam route to Leonard Taylor against Kyle Hamilton. I'm just like, Kyle, like Leonard Taylor's a solid little player, man, but like it's just not what should ever happen. Right.
No, and even that game, they scored why? You fumbled a ball inside your own 10.
Right.
You throw a terrible and this is like the weird thing about that game is I kind of felt like all year they would put Tyler Buckner in the game to start a drive. And that's when it would work. But I believe I'm correct on this. The series where he threw the pick, they brought him in during the drive.
It was more of like a in-series rotation,
right?
Than a series rotation.
Guess what? You got out of your norm, and it results in a pick six. In your biggest game, you went away from what had got you there, And lo and behold, guess what happens? You throw a pick. It wasn't a pick six. They ran it back. I think inside like the 10 or 15 and then
Something
scored
like that,
a little bit after that. But like, it's just stuff like that. Like I can live with the 2020 Bama loss to a degree. I mean, I thought like just the overall game plan on offense was just so like, let's not get blown out. But like they played hard. You know, Bama just made a bunch of plays. And there's stuff you got to clean up. But it wasn't like, why did they not cover Devontae Smith on that play?
Right.
No, it's Devontae Smith just shaking dudes that he's just better than. You know,
that's the biggest thing. Is like I'm going to continue to go back to the Cincinnati game because that was the last regular season game that I've been in person, Brian. Just in that game, I think to your point, Tyler Buckner's interception was in the red zone, right? I know it was definitely on their side of the 50. I can't remember if it was in the red zone or not, but Jack Cohn throws an interception in the red zone. Do you remember the drop by Kevin Austin later in that game where he's wide
right in
open
the middle
of the field?
Yeah.
It's not like
what happens in that game, Ryan, if Notre Dame goes down and scores a touchdown? To your point, what happens in that game if Notre Dame goes right down the field in Cincinnati and scores a touchdown instead of throwing it?
They had all the momentum at that point.
Right.
Notre Dame had all the momentum working there in that second half. And again, it's not like if Kevin Austin is working downfield against Ahmad Gardner, right, who just went fourth overall in the draft, and he didn't win the rep, I'd be like, okay, Ahmad Gardner's just better than him. Like, what do we want to say about that? But the fact of the matter is that he's wide open in the middle of the field, and it's just an egregious drop. Like, it's just bad. That's self-inflicted. That's lack of concentration. That's not lack of Jimmy's and the Joes there, right? Like, that's preparation, and that's like the mental side of the game, right? So there's a lot of those things that have just been like these weird, like self-inflicted things for whatever reason that you just can't have, especially in those big games, man. Like, you can't hurt yourself. The team you're playing against is a good football team already. That's why it's a big game. You can't have those self-inflicting things. Those things will just kill you. Absolutely kill you.
Yep. So we have a comment, Bill. And Bill, by the way, thank you for your super chat. We have a comment down here, and this is kind of the problem that I have with this. So Juan says Ohio State also got destroyed by Michigan. True. The only big game I remember Day winning at Ohio State was Clemson in 2020. At this point, Ohio State should be considered overrated. My thing is, I think you can make that argument, Ryan, but the problem is you can't make that argument over Notre Dame. Sure. Because you say the only big game I remember winning is a playoff game where they blew Clemson out, a team that had just beat Notre Dame a few weeks before by 3 touchdowns and a field goal. Right? I mean, that's the thing is if Notre Dame's only big game win was the 2018 playoff game against Clemson, then the narrative's a little different. Or if their only win was let's say they'd have beat Alabama in the semifinal in 2020 and then gone out and got beat convincingly by Ohio State, the narrative would be different. It wouldn't be ideal, like where you want it to be, but it would be different. I don't disagree that Ryan Day is I wouldn't say he's overrated. He's overrated in the technical sense. I think that he gets a lot of hype.
He's got a lot to prove.
He's got a lot to prove. Same with Lincoln Riley. They inherited great situations, and they didn't necessarily make them better. Like Ohio State hasn't been better since Ryan Day took over and say, well, you know, Urban had some really bad losses. You don't see the Iowa 17 loss anymore. You don't see the Purdue 18 loss anymore. And that's true. Then they get blown out. They're getting blown out by good teams now, but they're also winning some of those big games too. And that's the difference. You know, like I said, and even in some of the losses that they've had, I mean, the Clemson loss in 2019, which was Ryan Day's first season as head coach, it was a very competitive game. I mean, very competitive game. So I understand where you're coming from, and I don't necessarily disagree that Ryan Day is overrated. I actually don't disagree with that at all in the traditional sense of the word. I think the Big Ten hasn't been great. I think Penn State has consistently outcoached Ohio State in matchups, if we're going to be honest. They just don't have nearly the players as Ohio. I mean, they've battled Ohio State in each of the last 2 years during the stretch when Penn State's gone 11-11, right? They got stomped by the only good Michigan team that Ryan Day has faced, if we're being honest. Yeah, so he's overrated. But you can't, as a Notre Dame fan, you can't grab hold of that as some sort of counter to the Notre Dame narrative. You can only say, hey, well, you should be in the conversation with us, not as sort of a counterattack to why the narrative about Notre Dame exists. And that's the reality.
Two sides they can both exist. Right. Ohio State can be slightly overrated, but they can still be better than Notre Dame right now. Right. That's just, you know, like those things can exist.
Right. Where does their overrating come from? Wins. Winning the championship in 14. Right. You know, beating Clemson in 20. Look, because I'll say this right now. If Clemson would have done to Ohio State what Ohio State did to Clemson in the 2020 playoff, I guarantee you there'd be people talking about him being overrated. Guarantee it.
Sure.
Because now you'd be like, what's your big win, dude? You lost to Michigan for the first time in a decade. Not only did you lose to them, you got embarrassed by them. Like they physically stomped you. Right? What's your big win? Beating a depleted Utah team by like 3 in the Rose Bowl? Like, what's your big win, dude? Right? But he does have that win over Clemson to hang his hat on. And it wasn't like it was a fluky game and Clemson was missing a bunch of dudes. They just beat them convincingly.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so that's the thing is they have at least that, and they have a national championship. Now I know he didn't win it, but I'll gladly take Brian Kelly being overrated with a national championship under his belt, or Marcus Freeman being underrated with Notre Dame not necessarily that coach having one, but having Notre Dame having won a national championship. Like if Notre Dame wins a national championship this year, you can call them overrated all you want. I do not care. Do not care. Whatever. I got a ring. I just we're here. I got this.
We'll go to
right?
we'll go to the parade and we'll be all right.
Sure. Whatever. I don't care. Doesn't matter to me. So that's kind of where I'm coming from. And like I said, Juan, you're not wrong, but it's hard for Notre Dame to make that argument. And also, Ohio State's had some big losses, but some of their losses in those games have also been competitive. They also have the Michigan kicked their butt, but it was a 15-point loss. It's a little different than 41-8 against Miami. It's a little different than, 30-3 or 31-14 in the game you scored last. It's just a little different. And I understand why Notre Dame fans want to make that argument, and they're absolutely right. But it just doesn't really affect me that much because I don't care what Ohio State does. I care what Notre Dame does. And they got
Notre Dame. If Notre Dame wins on September the 3rd, then we can start fighting back against that narrative line.
And you can blow. And look, I'll tell you this right now. If Notre Dame wins that game, I can almost guarantee you that narrative will come out of it about Ryan Day. Those questions will exist about Ryan Day. You're hearing it a little bit from Ohio State fans, but it's hard to take anything they say seriously because they literally, I know Ohio State fans who literally think that they have the best roster in the country and it's not even close and that they should just smash everybody. They'll literally make that argument. It's like, well, if you don't win the national championship by 30, you're going to make them unhappy. I mean, they're insane. A lot of them are insane. But that's the thing is, Notre Dame has to be able to change that narrative by what they do on the field. And if they do win that game, I'm telling you, there's going to be some interesting stuff. Because think about this. If Ryan Day's last 2 losses were to the 2 other Midwestern powerhouse teams, one being at home, one being with the Big Ten championship on the line, there's going to be some stuff said. There's no doubt about it. Now, all of that doesn't mean a whole lot if Notre Dame doesn't win. And that's the thing. And he doesn't have to win by much. He just has to win. And same thing with Notre Dame. I don't care if Notre Dame beats them by 1 or 50. They just need to beat them. I don't care if it's 10-9 or 42-41. Don't care. Just win. That's it. That's all that matters. It's all that matters.
Win, baby. Just win,
baby.
baby.
Oh, you just had to. I was thinking it, but I was like, it's Al Davis, and he's a nut job, and I'm a Broncos fan, so I just couldn't go there.
I have a old scouting friend that was a scout under Al Davis. I have a lot of funny stories that I can tell you sometime. Not on the air though. Not on the air.
We'll have to do that. We'll have to do that for sure. Dan Muller with Super Chat. Thank you, Dan, very much. If you were calling the D versus Ohio State, would you rush 4 and drop 7 and try to avoid the big plays, or would you be aggressive using different blitz packages? And my answer is yes.
Yes.
And the whole thing is, Dan, is you created 2 different scenarios, and I think they both have to exist together. I think there have to be times when you do drop 7 and bring 4. I think there's times when it justifies dropping 8 and bringing 3. There are also times when it justifies bringing 6. Depending on how Ohio State's lined up and the scenario, and it's all about the big thing is, Dan, when you talk about calling plays against Ohio State, you can't let Ohio State get a read on what you're going to do, because do I think Ryan Day's a little overrated as a head coach? Yeah. Where I don't think he's overrated is as a play caller in games. He's a very good game day play caller, especially in the pass game. I think sometimes their run game is more about just having better dudes. But pass game wise, they're schemed well. They're not super complex, but he knows when to call when, what to call when, how to get guys in. He's really good at getting isolations and matchups and doing things like that, even though it's not like a super, super complex. Like one of the misnomers about his pass offense is that it's really complicated. It's really not, but that's partly what makes it so successful. He's got really good dudes, and he finds ways with formations, motions, shifts, and things like that to get into isolations, to use guys to clear guys off when they are in those isolations, to get guys in space. Does a great job with that. If he knows,
a lot of mesh.
Yeah, but it's done in ways where, like, I know who I'm trying to get open here. And if he knows what you're doing, he will rip you apart. He will rip you apart. Where teams have had some success against him, and I thought Northwestern did a great job of this in 2020, at least early on, before Ohio State just said, hey, our dudes are better than you, and you have no one that can stop Trey Sermon and our offensive line and all that kind of thing, and just ran it on him. But when they've had trouble is when their quarterbacks start guessing and thinking and like, I'm not sure what's happening here. And, they'll still get their like, so against Michigan last year, CJ still got his numbers. There's a lot of plays where he's taking sacks, throwing the ball away, missing players because he's not sure what he's seeing. And they bring somebody here, they show this, but then drop this guy or bring this guy and do all those types of different things. And that's when you have to have success. So do all those things. Use blitz packages. You can't blitz all day, though. You also can't drop 7 and 8 all day. Not against a good coach. But
and you don't want to, too, because, I mean, that's predictable, right? Like, you don't want to be predictable against a guy like a Ryan Day, because to your point, he's a really good play caller. So I agree with you. And to Dan's question, you need to mix everything up, right? Like, you can't just be a one-track defensive approach because that's too predictable for a good offensive coordinator, a good offensive play caller. I will say this, though, Brian, and I've talked about this a little bit in the past. I do think that I'll be able to tell a lot about, in my opinion, how successful Notre Dame's defense is if they are able to get home with 4, though. If you're able to get home with 4 consistently when you're in those situations, I think Notre Dame's going to be very, very good that day. So we'll see about that. But I do think that you have to mix everything up. But I do think it's very important for, at the end of the day, Isaiah Foskey has to get home. Jay Senamola has to get home. Those guys have to create pressure and take advantage of – they have to be better than the guys in front of them at the end of the day. So that's my biggest indicators. I think that there is something to Dan's question of, if you're able to get home with 4, then you're in a good spot, man. Because if you're getting home with 4, you're definitely going to be able to get home with 5. Definitely going to be able to get home with 6. Right. That just makes everything to a situation where, like, you could just toy with guys now. But you have to be better than the offensive line that day. You have to be.
Yep. So for me, I think it is a situation where getting home to me means hits, sacks, batted balls, for anything that creates a negative. And a negative to me isn't in the very technical sense of, did you get a -1? It's anything that creates them from getting positive yards is considered a win for the defense, in my opinion. So incompletions, sacks, tip balls, turnovers, hits on the quarterback, things along those lines are all musts. And to Ryan's point, you've got to be able to hit it home. There's no question about it. There's no question about it. All right, we got some more here. Really, really good stuff today. We have a question from Chief Brody. It says, sorry if this is super secret or belongs on the board, but what software do you use for hype vids and where did you get clips? Always wanted to try. iMovie.
Can I say this before you answer? So I texted Brian yesterday and asked him, this is between the chat and us right now. I told Brian, wow, did you learn how to edit videos yourself? And he took that as I was insulting him when I was giving him a compliment. Because I was impressed.
The way you said it was like, dude, did you teach yourself to do that? Like, you know what I mean? Like, dude, I had this thing. I was like, is that your way of saying you didn't like the video? But no, I just use iMovie and just I have there's a ways to kind of take a YouTube clip and turn it into video form to where you can then insert into iMovie and you just cut it up that way. So did the same thing with the audio, stuff like that. So it's just learn how to do that a little bit, but it's fun. And the thing is, you can't monetize it. That's why I put it up on my personal YouTube page and not on Irish Breakdown, because you're violating copyright if you do that and try to monetize it. So like, that's why I haven't put it on like an Irish Breakdown story to text that, even though it's a free story. I'm getting ad revenue from people reading that story. To me, maybe this isn't true legally, but to me, I view that as a potential copyright violation because I'm taking your copyrighted work, and I'm putting it into something that's going to then profit me. And, so we put it on the message board for fun, and that's the only place where it is. But yeah, that's just, it's fun to do. And I only did it because like the other night, it's like midnight and I'm like, dude, I can't sleep. I'm wide awake. Like I was like, I couldn't concentrate. And I was like, let me just make a little bit of a hype vid here real quick. So I put it together and finally got to bed around 5:30 that morning. So
you should make a highlight video of our podcasts, the best moments in Irish Breakdown.
Hard pass. I hate listening to myself. Like I do too. Like when I'm editing the show, I hate listening to myself. I was like, did I really sound like that? Gosh, man.
I know. My wife's always asked me if I listen to the podcast. I'm like, no, I was there. What do I need to listen to it?
Yeah, there's like, I'll tell you to listen to things sometimes just because we're trying to, hey, let's work on this or let's work on that or those different things. But yeah, John A1 asks, I assume Notre Dame still wants to be a multiple front defense. Which 7 players give you the most formation versatility without substituting? It's a really interesting question. Yeah, so multiple front. So I mean, I imagine you're mainly talking about sort of your front 7. Mm-hmm. That's an interesting one. I mean, I think that if I was putting together which defensive line alignment gives Notre Dame the best opportunity to be multiple without substituting ever, my lineup would look like this. Mm-hmm. Isaiah Foskey's my big end. Mm-hmm. I have Riley Mills and Jason Adamiola inside.
Agreed.
I have Jordan Patello as my Viper or Justin Adamiola as my Viper. One of those two. Mm-hmm. The reason I'd go with that is because I think Justin and Jordan, especially Jordan, can both play linebacker, like truly play linebacker. I think Jordan is a little twitchier and faster than Justin, but Justin's more disciplined and a good athlete in his own right. I think that 4-man tandem can do a 3-3 stack just as easily as they can do a 4-2-5, in my opinion. I think linebacker, it's kind of what it already is, right? I mean, again, because if you look at which alignment right now, it's also taking into account who has got the experience to be ready to step in and fill a certain role. I mean, in 6 months or a year, my answer could be Jalen Sneed in one of these spots. But where we are right now and what we know, it's Maris Luafau, it's J.D. Bertrand, and it's Jack Kaiser. I mean, I think the linebacking core is kind of where it is. Now, the potential exception would is depending on who you're playing, I could address a scenario in which I would actually like to see Clarence Thomas in the nickel and take out one of the linebackers. Now, whether that's J.D. Bertrand or Jack Kaiser is to be debated. But where I'd put Clarence Lewis in the nickel because as a base defense, because I could easily in a passing down swap him and Tariq Bracy, who'd be my field corner in this scenario. If we're going to play a team in a passing situation and I want to get Tariq inside in the matchup, I can easily do that. But against a running team, I got Clarence in the slot because he can give me a better force player against the run, perimeter run and perimeter pass. Force player meaning he's going to come up, take on the lead blocker, and force a bounce he's either going to spill it or force it back inside, right? You want a guy that's got a little bit of force there. That's why a lot of teams go with a rover as opposed to just putting a 5th pure DB in there, is because you need to be able to protect yourself against the perimeter runs and the perimeter throws. Because if you just put like a little cornerback out there and it's 3rd and 4, I got no problem running a bubble screen or a now screen because I know I can block your 2 cover corners off the line and get my guy free. But if I got a Jeremiah Owusu-Koramoah, Jack Kaiser out there, you better, you're taking a risk there because that guy's going to be able to got the speed to close, but also the physicality to blow up that lead blocker. So I think that would probably be my alignment, Ryan. And then I'd have Ramon Henderson in there too with Brandon Joseph at safety because I think you can do a lot of different things with Ramon as well. Yes. You can put him in the nickel, you can put him at outside, boundary. There's different things you can do with him as well as far as just a versatility. So that would be my alignment. Any major disagreements there?
I like that you dispelled that little because I'll say this from an NFL draft perspective. I've seen a lot of guys that just every undersized corner, they're like, oh, he could play nickel. And I'm like, but can he defend the run at all? Right. Can he be that force player? Like, can he do those types of things? And the answer is usually no. And I'm like, well, he can't play nickel then. I'm sorry. Not every small corner can play nickel. Sorry. So that was just a quick tangent.
Right. If we're talking about base downs, right? Because we're not talking about 3rd and 10. We're talking about 1st and 10. If I see a little 175-pound corner that can't take on a block, I'm running perimeter screens, perimeter runs and stuff at you all day. And you're not going to be. And as soon as you get your safety down to protect him, I'm doing a pump and throwing it over your head. I mean,
100%.
to your point, in base downs, you need a guy that can come up. And Tariq Bracy will battle, but he's small.
Sure.
And I'm going to put my slot. I'm going to put somebody on him that's just going to beat him up in the slot on 1st and 10. That's just what I'm going to do.
Yeah,
So,
absolutely.
Anyway, go ahead.
The only thing I would add is you stole my thunder with the Riley Mills inside thing. That's definitely my answer, right? Like Adam Alola and Riley Mills are playing inside. Isaiah Foskey and Justin Adam Alola were also the players that I would have picked. The only thing that I would add is that I would toy with Botello at Rover because I think in certain situations, Justin Adamalola drops, and then here comes Jordan Botello off the edge, right? So it's kind of they're almost similar players in the fact that I feel like they can mix and match.
Let me ask you this, Ryan. Let me ask you this: instead of putting him at Rover, what would be your stance? What would be your thoughts on putting him inside? So, like, you have Justin. So you have your three that we agree on, right? Jason Adamiola, Riley inside, and then Isaiah outside. Now, the thing I like about that is when you go to an odd front, you can either put Jason or Riley at nose, and then you'd have the other one at the edge with Isaiah on the edge. And then you take that other guy and drop him back. What would be sort of a thought in regard to saying, okay, you have that three, and then you have Justin Adamiola as your Viper, and then you kind of make Jordan Botelho sort of your – I wouldn't call him a rover, but he could just inside and then with Marist, because now you can do things where you can have him kind of at the mic and you can bring him on a fire and then drop Justin into coverage, right? Or you can drop him into coverage and bring Justin, or you can bring both of them and just go cover one, and then you can bring Jordan you can move Jordan around and bring him from anywhere. And the reason I would move Jordan off the ball in this scenario is because I think Jordan, because he's got a little bit more long speed than Justin's really quick in spaces. Jordan's more of a long distance, like good speed and range, which is why he's playing Rover. I would trust him getting to the quarterback on a blitz from depth than I would Jason, who I want at the line using his hand technique and all those type of things to win at the point of attack. What would you think about that? Would your concern be in passing downs, you're a little bit more vulnerable to the pass game with that guy in there? Or, I mean, what would your pushback to that be?
My biggest concern would actually be in the running game a little bit, right? So in that situation, I love the potential of moving a Jordan Botelho all over the place. Like you bring him off the edge at times, right, on some type of stunt or some type of movement. You must rush him a little bit, as kind of almost like a quarterback spy at times. You bring him on a delayed blitz and the A gap. All that stuff's great, Brian. My only thing though is that we've talked a little bit about like dependability with the Jordan Botelho, right? Sure. So like him playing Mike on base downs sometimes. And
I don't know if I would have him playing Mike though.
Player.
Yeah, I don't know. I'd probably have Maris playing Mike. I'd probably have Maris playing Mike and then kind of move him around a little bit.
I'd be okay with that then. I'd be okay with that. If I'm literally just using him as a movable chess piece on the second level, then I am good with that. Right. I just don't want to get stuck where like I now have to depend on you to be a complete run
to make all the line calls. Right.
Yes.
100%. Because the only reason we would make this kind of a lineup is if we're playing a team that spreads.
Yes.
That's why you would need this if you're playing Stanford 2011, 2012,
you're gonna play this,
you don't need this versatility. You just line up and put your big boy pants on, line up in your 4-2-5 and say, let's get after it. You know what I mean?
Smacks the Fontaine.
That's right. Exactly. That's right. Exactly. And now Jordan is my rover in that scenario, right? Mm-hmm. And that would be the only change I would make. They're just that team's not on the schedule right now. It's more of the Clemsons, the USCs, the Ohio States, the North Carolinas, the BYUs, stuff where that type of alignment would make a lot of sense. So that's a good discussion. Really, really good question. Really good question.
It's fascinating, honestly. Yeah.
We have a question down here from Mr. Adamiola, who is a friend of the show. We love him very much because I have a question. What will be the narrative on the Notre Dame defensive line if Notre Dame wins and the boys do great? I think here's what the narrative will be. It will no longer be Isaiah Foskey and a bunch of dudes, right? Because that's what we said. And I actually respect Bruce Feldman a lot. I don't view him as a hot take guy. I just don't. I think in this instance, I just don't think he's knowledgeable of who Notre Dame is. He's kind of buying into the perceived notion because he's a reporter. He's not an analyst that's breaking down all 22 all game. So I'm not taking a shot at Bruce Feldman here because I actually have a lot of respect for Bruce Feldman. I think he does a great job. He's, when he talks about what he's hearing, like I know he didn't just hear from one person and he's running with it. He's done his homework. So ton of respect for Bruce Feldman, right?
Mm-hmm.
So, but I'm making the point of the narrative that he is backing, not so much that like I don't put him in the same category of like Paul Feinbaum so I just want to make sure I'm clear on that. But what he's doing is sort of disrespecting Notre Dame unintentionally by saying Isaiah Foskey and maybe another guy or two, meaning like none of those other dudes are even worth mentioning at this point in time.
Mm-hmm.
And I think what happens, Mr. Adamiola, is if the boys do well and Notre Dame, it'll be a factor in Notre Dame winning, as we talked about earlier in the show, is other guys have to step up. It's no longer going to be Isaiah Foskey and the other guys. It's going to be Notre Dame's defensive line is legit. How do you defend Foskey? How do you defend the Adamiola twins? They move Justin all over the place. Jason's unblockable inside. This Riley Mills kid, where the heck did he come from? And I think that's the narrative, is where it's kind of like how we saw it change in 2012. I mean, Manti was always a big name, but nobody was ever talking about Manti being what Manti became until Notre Dame started winning big games. And then all of a sudden, Lewis Nix's perception starts to change. He starts to become a name that people talk about. Stephon Tuitt steps up and makes plays. Now, all of a sudden, he's a name that people are talking about. So it's not Manti and everybody else. It's now, wow, look how good, Irish Chocolate's a legend now, right? Because of that season, right? Stephon Tuitt really only had one great season at Notre Dame. That's it. It was 2012. But people talking about how he's one of the best defensive linemen Notre Dame's ever had because of why? That one season. So I think that's really what the narrative becomes is, wow, Notre Dame's – and I think you start to hear things like this. Notre Dame's a lot more talented than I thought. They've got more speed than I thought. Gee, they're more disruptive than I thought. And then over the next month, if they continue to build on it, then you start seeing more specifically the discussion about the specific players. It won't happen just because of that game, but people start taking a look at what else happened. So unless they win and Isaiah Foskey has 5 sacks, nobody else does anything, right? And the boys do well, then I think that's what happens. And I think the other thing, too, is if the boys do well in that game and Notre Dame keeps winning, it's going to be some really interesting NIL calls. Because wouldn't you want a pair of twins on a top-ranked Notre Dame defense to be 100%. Representing your stuff? So that's the other thing that I think would be a big part of that as well.
I think it's, I mean, to your point, Brian, I think it's just about putting from a national perspective, because we know a lot about the Adamiolas. We know a lot about Riley Mills. Like, we know the high school background, recruiting background, statistics, big games that they've had, like all that type of stuff, right? Like because we watch every single game. But from a national perspective, it's putting a name to a face at that point, right? Because I'm sure most people that have watched a Notre Dame game, occasionally you're like, oh, 57 looks like a decent player, right? Like, oh, Justin is quietly, Justin was second in the team in sacks last year. So like, you'll kind of get those flashes of like, oh, there's 9 again, there's 57, there's this player, 99, all that type of stuff, right? But eventually then people will go, oh, I kind of probably have to look this guy up because like he keeps making plays. Making plays. So the name recognition, I think, is the biggest thing that'll change. Is it's going to be a different label. It's going to be Notre Dame has a really good defensive line. It's not going to be, wow, Isaiah Foskey's really good and Notre Dame's got a couple okay players beside him. Because we know that that's not the fact of it, but it is the national perception.
Can we be honest about some things? Georgia had some guys drafted a lot higher last year because of their success. Not that Trayvon Walker would have been a 7th-round draft pick if they don't win the national title. But I think it certainly helped them go number 1. I think they had some guys go on day 2 that probably are day 3 guys if they don't go out and make the run that they had. And the run involves in success. The success is now, to Ryan's point, hey, we'll draft a guy that doesn't even start at linebacker in the 3rd round because why? Boy, that defense was great. And the narrative is it's so great that even this guy can't even get on the field. Right? That's how the narrative changes, and I think those are the things that kind of go into it. Absolutely. Cole Barker with a super chat. Thank you, Cole. Do you see Lou Holtz having a big impact on Marcus Freeman? Do you see similarities in how they coach football practice? No, they coach football practice very differently. Where I think the similarities exist, Cole, is, and where I think that he'll have an impact on him, is I personally believe there's 2 people right now as coaches that are having a major impact on Marcus Freeman. Jim Tressel and Lou Holtz. And there's a lot of similarities between Tressel and Holtz. Toughness, accountability, love your kids, love your players. Now, loving players doesn't always mean hugging and kissing them because they did something good. Sometimes it means kicking them in the butt,
Tough love,
and getting on them. And Lou Holtz was great at that. Jim Tressel believed in that. Now, I won't let anybody else talk about you, but sometimes I'm going to chew you out a little bit. And I think he's impacted by that. I think there are also guys that believe in that understand the need to be disciplined, to be accountable, to be, to play physical football. I think where Lou Holtz is going to have the greater impact is truly helping Coach Freeman understand what makes Notre Dame unique and special and how to utilize that, specifically what makes Notre Dame, because Jim Tressel can't speak to that. Jim Tressel can only give his impression of Notre Dame as an outsider, and I'm sure it's respectful because Jim Tressel grew up in a coaching era when Notre Dame was a big-time program. So there's going to be a level of respect there. He's recruited against Notre Dame a bunch of times back in the day. And so, to me, I think that's where he can, Lou Holtz can also help. It's like, hey, yeah, this is all good, but here's here's a way that you can tie Notre Dame into this and make it special and make it good. I think those are things, Ryan, that where Lou Holtz could have a big impact on Jim Tressel.
Yeah, I think the biggest thing, and you mentioned it, I think it's just the understanding of what makes Notre Dame special. And you talked about that, right? So like, I'll reiterate it just a little bit, is that Marcus Freeman wasn't, I know he obviously knows Notre Dame, like Notre Dame's a big brand, obviously, right? But like, it's much different familiarity from an outsider's perspective, being at Ohio State, being at Cincinnati, doing a little, the Chicago Bears for a little bit as far as a player perspective, and then actually being a part of the program, right? And having that perspective. So that's different. But there's also a next level, to Brian's point, where Marcus Freeman's not coaching during the golden era of Notre Dame football, right? Like, it's been a long time since it's been that way. So Lou Holtz has a very unique perspective of, he understands what it takes to get there, and at least what it took his teams to get there. It's going to be different because it's a different era, right? But he still has the perspective of, this is what Notre Dame can provide. This is what has made Notre Dame players successful. This is what made the program successful. So I think it's just perspective, right? Like, that's the biggest thing for me, is that I think great coaches and great people just in general, professionals, take what people have done before them and have made them successful and make it their own. He's not going to do everything that Lou Holtz did because he can't, right? Like, it's not possible.
And he's not Lou Holtz.
It's a different game.
Right.
100%. And he needs his own identity. But a part of his identity could be taking something from Lou Holtz that was unique to him and making it his own. So I think it's just the perspective is the biggest thing for me.
Yeah. Let's go to the next question here. We Chris Basker asked, just bought tickets to the Ohio State game. What's the plan for IB at the game? We won't be doing anything at that game tailgate wise and things like that, just because we're going to be kind of traveling that day. So we'll be there, we'll be around, but kind of once we get there, I'm heading into the press box and getting set up for that. So we won't have anything. We'll obviously the next week against Marshall at home, we'll have a big tailgate, which will be a lot of fun. Ryan Loftus says, how would you say this 2022 front seven compares to the 2012 front seven? I think you kind of have to look on it as what it was going into the season, because I don't think anyone anticipated Notre Dame being what they were in 2012. I think they expected to be good on defense, because guess what? They were good on defense in 2011. I've said this before, but Bob Diaco had Notre Dame as a top 25 scoring defense in each of his first 3 years at Notre Dame. What hurt them in the previous years was they just weren't really good when it came to scoring, right? But in 2011, Notre Dame finished 24th in the nation in scoring defense at 20.7 points per game, which wasn't great, but it was good. And in 2010, they finished 23rd in scoring defense. I mean, I think people thought Notre Dame would be good on defense, but not like what they were. And so, I mean, it's just, Ryan, it's hard to compare because it's so different. That was a traditional 3-4, 2-gapping defense. You had a massive nose tackle, a huge big end in Capron Lewis Moore. You had physical downhill linebackers. You're a lot of cover two, a lot of roll coverages where you're using your corners to kind of be physical. Your Zeke Mata Zeke Mata is not playing safety in today's defense. He's a rover, if not a will, if not a will, and so those things are just all different. And I think the thing about that 2012 defense, however, that this defense needs to adopt is that 2012 defense could really stop the run. and really shut down the run game. I mean, in the regular season, the most yards they gave up all year was 161 against Michigan, but Michigan averaged 3.9 yards per carry in that game. You can have 161 yards if you're only averaging 3.9 a carry and scoring 6 points. So I think those are the things I look at. I mean, in the regular season, only 2 teams went above 4.0 yards per carry in a game, and that was Pitt with 4.4, and and then Miami at 4.7. Miami only had 84 rushing yards, only had 18 carries because they had if memory serves me correctly, Stephen Morris had like a 20-something yard scramble at one point in time in that game, which is where a lot of their yards came from. But I think that's the thing for me is if they can be like that, that's great. But this is a much smaller defense. It is a much faster defense. We need to find out now if it can be as effective as a defense. And that's what we don't know.
Didn't that 2012 team only give up like 1 rushing touchdown all year? Like it was a crazy stat, wasn't it?
I know they hadn't given up one until the Oklahoma game.
I remember that one. It was like they went, what was it, 6 or 7 games without living up a rushing touchdown or something like that.
And
like
Blake Bell scored it, and he didn't score it till the second half of that game. Yeah, Pitt's. I'm pretty sure Pitt. I could be wrong. Yeah, Pitt had a rushing touchdown in that game, so that was a second one. I know that there was. It wasn't many, Ryan. And I'm looking up the box scores now. I knew they gave up another one, and Pitt had one. I thought that's the reason that was the first game I went to is because I was at that game. And I thought I remembered Pitt having like a 15, 20-yard touchdown run. But after that Pitt game, they only gave up 6-0 and 13 points in the next 3 games to end the regular season. But obviously they also gave up – you're talking regular season because they gave up several rushing touchdowns in the national championship game. But Ryan was talking regular season. But, yeah, USC didn't have one. They were all field goals. BC was all field goals. They shut out Wake Forest. So, yeah, they ended up giving up 2 rushing touchdowns in the regular season that year. That's it.
That's insane. That's insane. And then Eddie Lacy happened in the national championship.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. Which I finally did watch the Manti thing, by the way.
Did you like it?
Yeah.
I think you said you liked it, right?
I tweeted it. Yeah, I did. But here's the thing is in that game, though, if you look at it, Eddie Lacy happened, but Eddie Lacy only had 1 rushing touchdown in that game. And TJ Yeldon had 1 rushing. Bam only rushed for 2 touchdowns in that game. So that means that defense in the entire year only gave up 4 rushing touchdowns the entire year. AJ McCarron threw 4 touchdown passes in that game. That's absolutely insane. Like
and for context, what was the running back? CJ Verdell ran for 4 or 5 touchdowns against Ohio State last year. For context,
So you want to talk about something funny? I put this on the message board last night. Shocker! I couldn't sleep again last night, Ryan. But I was like, I wonder what the narrative was like going into that game last year. Really thinking about like, how did people view that game? And I'm watching it. I'm like watching these bold predictions that these Ohio State people are doing, and then matchups, and they're like, they couldn't even run the ball on Fresno State. They're not going to be able to run on Ohio State. They're going to win by 35 points. I mean, just some of the predictions for that game were just like laughable. Now that you look at the outcome, I mean, I understand it going in, but now that you know the outcome, it's kind of laughable if I'm being honest about it. But it was just kind of one of those things where, look, you really don't know what you don't know until your team gets out there. And we can kind of make fun of them all we want and all that other kind of stuff. But to put how good that defense was into context, I mean, Georgia had an all-time great defense last year. They gave up 3 rushing touchdowns in 15 games. Notre Dame gave up 4. I mean, so Georgia in 2019 gave up 2. I mean, they would have led the nation. Wisconsin, I don't even count 2020 because Wisconsin only gave up 2, but they played 7 flipping games. 5, they would have led the nation in 2016, 15, 14, 13, led it in 12. I mean, the great Alabama defense of 2011, which was a great Alabama defense, gave up 3 touchdowns that year, rushing touchdowns that year. That was it. I mean, so that was a phenomenal year of running. And one of them was by a quarterback. I mean, he was a designed running quarterback, but it was by a quarterback. In
Bulldozer, man.
Yeah.
He's actually kind of lasted in the NFL a little bit as a backup.
Is he still in the NFL?
I think he's still in there. Yeah, pretty sure.
That's hilarious. Chief Brody asks, it feels like Notre Dame under Kelly rarely was able to play anywhere near their best games in the big stages, to be honest. I mean, I think, Brody, that's the big thing. I mean, that's why this narrative exists, is Notre Dame just, I mean, laid an egg. I mean, there's some years, I mean, honestly, if you go back and look at Lou Holtz's tenure, there's some years where, as we look back with nostalgia, we love Lou Holtz because we remember the Sugar Bowl win over Florida. We remember the beating number one Colorado in a bowl game in 1989. You know, we remember a lot of that stuff. We remember the big wins. But what we forget in 1991 is, yes, they won that big game over Florida, but they got spanked at Penn State. They blew a huge lead at home against Tennessee, and they got beat by 10 at Michigan, right? And so why do we remember it? Because we remember them winning that big spotlight bowl game nobody thought that they could win. And in 1990, you know, Notre Dame plays this great game against number one Colorado. They showed out, looked good doing it, but we kind of forget they lost at home to Penn State that year. They lost at home to Stanford that year. You know, like they won the big games. They beat number 4 Michigan, right? Like, because we remember those big wins because there were so many of them. It made it easier to kind of overcome the losses, right? And so, you know, when you look at just kind of Lou Holtz's tenure, the one thing Lou always did was win the big games. I mean, they go into the Cotton Bowl after the 1992 season. Notre Dame gets beat by 17 at home against Stanford. It's embarrassing. But what do we also remember about that year? Blowing out a top 10 Penn and BC team, beating a ranked Penn State team in the Snow Bowl, right? Going on the road and beating a ranked USC team. We remember them beating number 4 Texas A&M by 25 in the Cotton Bowl, right? We remember those games, and that's why the narrative about Lou Holtz is different than the narrative about Brian Kelly, because the overall win percentages aren't dramatically different. I mean, Lou Holtz has definitely, you know, I'm going to pull this up. Lou Holtz has definitely a better overall win percentage than than Brian Kelly. But the thing about it is it's not like this insane number, right? So like Lou Holtz, for example, had a 765 win percentage at Notre Dame. Brian Kelly's 731 is what they list here, but it was better than that because they took the 12 wins away. So actually, if you let's see here, so 106 plus 21. Let's see here. I just want to make sure I'm getting this correct because I want to be fair to Coach Kelly. Let me see if that was actually correct. No, they gave him those wins. So they gave him the 106 wins. So they gave him the voided victories. His win percentage was 731. Lou Holtz's was 765, which is pretty good. But Lou Holtz's, the gap between Lou Holtz and era was greater than the gap between Lou Holtz and Brian Kelly. And then, of course, it's even greater when you look at Frank Leahy and Newt Rockne. But here's the difference, is that Brian Kelly, his era to me is considered a disappointment because he didn't win the games that truly mattered, and Lou Holtz did. Brian Kelly did not lose games late in his career to teams that were inferior the way that Lou Holtz lost to teams that were inferior. You didn't have a 17-point home loss to an unranked Stanford team under Brian Kelly the last 5 years. But what you also didn't have is the win over Florida, number 2 USC, number 1 Colorado. You didn't have all those things. And I had this going the other day, Ryan. You saw me put this on the board, but here is, when you get down to it, here's what separates the two. In his career, Lou Holtz went 33, 21, and 2 against teams that were ranked in the top 25 at the time. Brian Kelly went 23 and 24. In Lou Holtz's tenure against teams that finished ranked in the top 25, he went 31, 23, and 2. Brian Kelly went 19 and 29. Here's where it gets really big. Against top 10 teams, Lou Holtz, so these are games where you're playing a top 10 ranked team. Lou Holtz went 21, 15, and 1. And if you look at his first year and his last year, those inflated the stats even more. And so, but Brian Kelly went 4 and 14 against teams that were ranked in the top 5 when they played. Notre Dame was 12 and 8. And again, if you go look at his first season and his last season, you see where I'm talking about. So, like, for example, in Lou Holtz's first year, replacing a fired coach, Notre Dame that season played his first 2 years, I should say. Notre Dame played, two games against top 10 teams, lost them both. And then he had several later in his career. were like losing Ohio State and games like that when they weren't that good. Like if you look at the stretch when they were really good, it gets even more impressive. I'm trying to find the article that I have here, or the breakdown that I have here. So if you just give me a second, I have this all broken down year by year. So let me find it here real quick. Let's see if it's in my Notre Dame folder. Let's see here, coach comparison, because it's a really fascinating number. But anyway, even without that, as I still look for that, the reality is Ryan is 12-8 against teams that ranked in the top 5. Lou Holtz went 12-8. Like that is a phenomenal statistic. So here we go. So in 19, and let's go down here. Do we have Brian Kelly's numbers down here? Yes. So from 1988 to 1993, Notre Dame went 7-1, 10-2, 11-4. See here, 12-5-1, 14-5-1. So I'm trying to do the math here. So from 1990, so talking about teams that finished ranked. Actually, let's go with teams that were ranked when they played. He had 14 wins over top 10 teams from 1988 to 1993. Teams that finished ranked in the top 10. But if you just look at games, that's really good. If you just look at where games were when they played, so it's 4-0, see 7, 8-1, see 9-1, 10-1, 11-1, 11-2, 11-3, 11-4, 12-4. I mean, it's an absurd number, Ryan. I mean, Brian Kelly, how many? Let's flip it to Brian Kelly. Against teams that were ranked in the top 5 when they played, Brian Kelly's teams were 1-8. The only win being against Clemson.
Right? Yeah, with a backup quarterback.
Right now, Notre Dame beat 2 top 5 teams in Brian Kelly's tenure. The other was against Michigan State in 2013. But when they beat Michigan State, they were unranked. Now that doesn't take away from the greatness of the win, because that was a great win. But my point is, it wasn't the perceived big game matchup of other games
at the time.
So there's just a different stress level. And to Chief Brody's point is and we've heard this from other former players and other coaches, like it was such a tightly wound environment in those weeks where it just was like, it was just not and Lou Holtz we've heard this from Lou Holtz players. It was, they loved Miami week. They loved the big game week because that's when the coaches were, not that they weren't demanding, but like, it wasn't like, it was in other weeks where they were just like constantly on you about everything. They understood that these kids understand. They know what it takes to get ready for this game. Now it's about us getting them ready. So you're absolutely right. And that, Chief Brody, is why the perception exists about Notre Dame and why a lot of fans, and I think Chief Brody's among them, that think that this is going to be a step back year. Why did Notre Dame fans think this is going to be a step back year? It's not because Brian Kelly's gone. It's because they look at the schedule and they're like, oh, 3 top 10 teams. Oh, that's 3 losses. Well, there's reason for that because they don't win those games. So I don't agree with it, but I can understand it. Right. Sure. And so, but that's earned. You've earned that reputation because Brian Kelly's teams, not only did they lose those games, Ryan, but more often than not, they weren't even competitive.
They got embarrassed. Yeah. Right.
And that's the difference. And that's what's got to change. That's what's got to change. All right. Next question we've got here. Let's see here. This is a good one. He says, BVG attempted to operate a complex NFL defense. How does Golden's style compare? Well, number one, we don't know what Al Golden's defense is going to look like. Number two, it wasn't the complexity of Brian Van Gorder's defense that was the problem. It's that Brian Van Gorder didn't understand the complexity of his defense, right? I mean, the fact is he didn't know how to teach it. That's the problem. He didn't know how to teach it. And because he didn't know how to teach it, everything had to be kind of run through him, because he couldn't teach his players to, when you see this, like here's an example. When I had coaches like this, and we had a defensive coordinator, my last coaching job. We ran a 4-2-5, but he spent a lot of time with Gary Patterson, or not with Gary Patterson, but learning Gary Patterson's defense. And one of the things that Gary Patterson mastered, which is why the 4-2-5 was so successful for so many years, was there was built-in calls. So if a team went tempo, you had built-in calls based on 3-by-1 or 2-by-2. So you knew if they line up a 3-by-1, you know have an automatic call. And then when the team shows that they're not going to snap it, then you look over and get the call from the defensive coordinator, right? So Ryan, you know what I'm talking about? Like teams will go tempo and they'll line up and they'll do the clap, and then they look over they're like, okay, we see, and then they look over the coach. That's when the defense would then get a call from the defensive coordinator. But if they were just going to go fast, the Mike linebacker and the safeties were making calls. This is what we're running: 3-by-1, 2-by-2. This is the call. These are the built-in calls. And so, but you have to be able to teach that. You have to be able to make sure your players know the defense as well as you know the defense as much as possible. With Van Gorder, he didn't understand the defense. So how could he possibly get his players to understand it? And so it was unnecessarily complex. And it was also poorly schemed. It wasn't just that it was too hard to learn. He didn't know what calls to make. You know, on 3rd and 8, the players not knowing how to run the defense against Michigan State in 2016, that's not the reason Michigan State converted to 3rd and 8 late in the game when the game is on the line. It's because he decided to drop Jay Hayes and Jerron Jones into coverage. That's not the scheme is bad. Like, I could draw that up on a board and be like, yeah, it's okay, it makes sense. But he didn't know how to use his players, and he didn't understand like how this call is going to impact the other team you're going to play. You're going to ask Jerron Jones to drop underneath a deep end cut. That's stupid. You're going to ask 295-pound Jay Hayes to get up underneath the hook curl route, something he's never done in his life, right? It's stuff like that. It's not that it was complex. It was just stupid. And so there are complex defenses that work. Clemson runs a somewhat complex defense, I think, under Brent Venables. His blitz package is pretty extensive.
Yeah.
So, I mean, there are complex defenses that work in college football. Nick Saban's defense isn't necessarily simple, especially under Kirby's defense isn't simple. It's not just line up and we're better than you. There's a lot of different stuff that they do. And I think the perception is that, well, they're just better than everybody else. They just line up in a 3-4 and beat your tail. No, that's not it. It's got some stuff to it. And so to me, it's not so much the complexity. It's just he was not a good coach, didn't know how to coach technique, didn't know how to teach the players what he knew, because, you know, he's basically getting it from somebody else's playbook. And
well, it's like it's like a teacher in a classroom going into a class and not ever having read the curriculum, right? Like, you know what you have to teach, but like you don't understand it fully of like how the process of teaching it is going to work. So I think that the Al Golden thing is going to be interesting because we've talked, I mean, I think structurally it's going to be similar to what Marcus Freeman wants to do, obviously, or has wanted to do at Notre Dame last year. But Al Golden's been around a lot of different defenses in his career, man. Like, they were a 3-4 team during his Temple days. I know when he was at Virginia, they were a 3-4 team too, if I remember correctly. They had like Ahmad Brooks and all those dudes as well.
Kai Parham, Chris Long. Yeah.
So he's had like 3-4s a ton, but then he's with Cincinnati most recently, and when he was at Miami, they were also a 4-man front. So it's more of like a 4-3, 4-2-5 type of terminology. So I think the best part of it to the question is I don't think that there is a complete answer, because I do think that it's going to be multiple. I do think there's going to be a lot of different layers to it. I don't think that it's going to be just a 3-4 or just a 4-3. Right. I think that there's going to be some complexity, not to the scheme as much, but just the versatility and variety of being able to run multiple fronts, I think, is going to be prevalent. That's just speculation, but we'll see in less than 2 weeks.
Agree. Next question from Robert Bishop. Should the fact that our defense practices every day against a quarterback that can run help with more this year? Last year they saw Jack every day in practice and he couldn't run to save his life. I don't think so, honestly. Number one, because they can't tackle Tyler Buckner. Number one. Number two, they played against a scrambling quarterback in 18 and 19 in practice and still couldn't stop a scrambling quarterback in Ian Book. Now, Ian Book wasn't the runner that Brandon Wimbush is, but it's not designed quarterback runs that have been the problem for Notre Dame. They can blow those up because it's a run. You got run fits. It's the scrambles that have proven problematic. And I just don't think you're going to see Tyler Buckner doing a lot of that in practice, especially against first-team defense. If he does, you can't tackle him, and it's hard to simulate that. So, and
you also, I mean, the first-team defense is also, they saw Tyler Buckner last year in practice too. Like, you don't usually go first-team O versus first-team D. You know, like usually it's the second, third-string quarterbacks that are running the scout.
You're out of that now, Ryan. Like, you did it the first couple weeks of fall camp. This week and moving forward, they're not facing Tyler Buckner in a bunch of teams. They'll still go ones-on-ones at times, But I mean, there's a reason that other players are wearing different jerseys. Other people are like, hey, there's a bunch of number changes. No, they're just certain scout team guys. The biggest mistake I ever made in my career as a journalist or, whatever I do. And this is why I learned an incredibly valuable lesson. You don't just report something because you see it or hear it, think at one time. It was the year that Kavari Russell was suspended. I was walking to practice, and this is like, 13, 14. And I'm looking at practice, and I see a number 6 playing corner, and it looked a lot like Kavari. And I ended up, I don't remember what I did. I might have said something on the message board. I can't remember how I got it out, but it was like, it wasn't Kavari. They were running scout team. You learn a lesson doing that, when you make that kind of mistake. I mean, that's why they're doing that now, right? Is because of that. And because they're now prepping for Ohio State, just like Ohio State's now prepping for, whoever's lining up against the Ohio State defense this week is wearing number 12, not whatever his normal number is, unless it is his normal number. Irish Gordy Knott, how thankful are you that we have a big game to start the year, so you don't have to constantly say that we can't look past the first team? In past years, we always want to look ahead to the big game. Agree, Ryan. This would be a battle we had in the past. Is we would be doing prep for Louisville. And it was Louisville, then New Mexico, right? And each of those 2 weeks, nobody wanted to talk about that. I just want to talk about Georgia. It's like, okay.
Oh, yeah.
Guys, we're talking about Louisville. No, we don't care. I'm going to play Georgia. I get it. I mean, I wouldn't want to sit there and listen to an analysis of New Mexico either when Georgia's coming up next week. But, yes, it is nice. It is nice to be able to not have to worry about that and just focus on the next team is the big game.
And you get an early indicator of how good this team can be, right? Like, you don't have to muddle through a couple of bad opponents and be like, okay, it looks good, but like, what's it going to look like on the big stage against better players, all that good stuff. You get it's not going to be it's not going to be the true indicator of how good Notre Dame's going to be. Like, Notre Dame's going to improve, obviously, you hope, in a lot of different areas from game 1 to game 12, but you're also going to get an indication early. Like, can they handle the pressure? What do they look like? Can they match intensity? All that good stuff. You're going to get a lot of indicators of just how good this team can be in game 1, which would be fun.
It's interesting. The question that we had earlier was about, will Notre Dame kind of practice against Tyler Buchner help them against mobile quarterbacks? Well, we're worried about CJ moving the chains with his legs, but I'm not worried about CJ ripping you the way that Spencer Sanders did, right?
Sure.
Now, here's the thing that I thought was a really good question that was down here from Jawan Craig. Is he says, Buchner will keep Ohio State defense on their heels as well. Ohio State will struggle versus the read option and his dynamic ability. That's an interesting take because there is no way for Ohio State to simulate Tyler Buchner's running ability. It is going to be easy. Yeah. If Notre Dame, let's say Notre Dame is going to play a Denard Robinson type of guy, they may say, hey, you know what? On Wednesday's practice, we're going good on good. And you're going to have to chase Tyler around. Can't hit him, but you're going to have to chase him around to get ready for a game. I mean, again, can Tyler Buchner beat Denard Robinson? No. But can he still give you a look that makes you like, hey, you got to chase. You have to be disciplined. Yes. Who does that for Ohio State?
You might even, like, if it's a Denard Robinson, you might even throw, like, a backup corner that was an option quarterback.
Or like if he was still healthy, like Avery Davis, right? Like if he was still healthy and Avery Davis, you're absolutely right. But Tyler Buchner could be that guy. But that's what Ohio State's going to have to do. I mean, honestly, there may be times in practice they're going to have to put like a running back at quarterback or a receiver at quarterback. Yeah. Like put Caleb Brown back there on scout team and let him simulate Tyler Buchner because they don't have a quarterback that can move like him. Devin Brown ain't doing that. I mean, with all due respect, Kyle McCord is a good athlete for a quarterback. He ain't Tyler Buchner. Sure. So that's going to be an interesting aspect of this as well. There's no question. Yeah. There's no question.
Yeah, I might put one of their backup running backs or somebody as like if you're trying to work on just like the quarterback power game, quarterback option stuff. Like, I would consider it just kind of the simulation type of thing.
Yep. So that's a very interesting point. But see, when you do that, you then don't have a guy that can also throw it over your head. If you put a running back or a receiver at quarterback and he's just scrambling around, the safety's thinking, oh, there he goes, bam, go get him. You do that against Tyler Buchner, he pulls it up, throws it over your head like he did to Toledo last year. And it's a big time play. And that's what makes it hard for those guys to prepare for. I mean, there's part of the reason is Notre Dame's not gap discipline. They don't tackle well. But the other part of it is those guys are just really hard to bring down sometimes, even if you do everything right. And that's what makes those guys really dynamic. Makes them very, very dynamic. So we have a Another question here. Let's get to some more as we wrap this up. C-Mac says, Brian, who's the starting 4 linebackers in Golden's base? Well, I think they're going to be a four down, so 4-2-5, which is basically Notre Dame. I think under Al Golden's base defense will be a 4-2-5 alignment with 4-3 personnel. Do you agree with that, Ryan?
Yes,
because we both consider Rovers to be linebackers in that situation, and I think in that case, Ryan, it's Maris, JD, and Jack Kaiser most likely. You agree with that?
Mm-hmm.
But we'll see a rotation. I think we'll see Prince Colley play. I think we'll see Bo Bauer play. I won't be shocked if we see Junior Tuihalamaka play. I won't be incredibly shocked if we see Jalen Sneed play at some point in time. Maybe not in the opener against Ohio State, but I'll be shocked if we don't see Jalen at least against Marshall and Cal at some point in time.
Mm-hmm.
Josh Phillips asks, who do you guys think will emerge as a starter at nose tackle, Cross or Lacey? I think Howard Cross is the clear number 1 in this instance. But they're both going to play, and they're both going to be very important to what they do. Neither one of those guys are going to dominate the snaps the way Kurt Hinish did in past years, in my opinion.
100%. Yeah, I would say Cross gets the majority of the reps, but I really do think there's times when Jacob.
You mean majority, meaning Brian? Like 51% to 49%, or the way that Kurt Hinish did in the
percentage.
Okay.
The higher.
No, I mean I'm not trying to like crack on you. No, it's not the point of what I'm asking. I'm asking, are you thinking he's going to dominate the nose tackle reps the way that Kurt Hinish dominated the nose? Because I don't think that's going to be the case.
No, I think it's going to be like 55 to 60% of the snaps go to Howard Cross, like something in that ballpark. Like he'll have the majority of the snaps.
Yeah, I think he'll have the majority, but I think it'll be lower than 60.
Low percentage.
Unless here's the caveat. I'm just talking nose tackle snaps.
I was talking between the two of them.
Yeah, no, I am too.
You know what I'm saying?
I am too. Yeah.
Okay.
What I'm saying is like my point was just snaps while they're playing nose tackles. I could see scenarios where one of the two gets more reps because they're playing the other interior position is what I'm saying. So like, let's say Howard gets, 60-40 split of total snaps, but that's because he played 8 snaps as a 3 technique in a certain alignment. Or Jacob plays a couple more snaps than Howard because he was kind of rotating in as the 3 technique as well kind of scenario. Okay. And then there's snaps where neither of them are on the field. So that's what I mean but when I say I think that Howard plays more, but it will be less is just pure nose tackle.
That's fair.
Snaps.
I get what you're saying. Yeah, no, that makes sense. I think regardless though, Jacob Lacey has given you a lot of flashes. It's just been few and far between because of some injuries, obviously, during his career. I think Jacob Lacey is a very important player to this interior defensive line, though. I think he needs to stay healthy and he needs to play.
Yes.
100%.
No doubt.
Because there's some really nice flashes there, man. Like last year, there were some plays where you're like, oh, that's different. That's nice. You know what I mean? So it's just about being healthy with a guy like a Jacob Lacey.
Yep. No doubt. Let's get to Domerson's births at IB family. I'm in the process of moving from California to Tennessee. Thanks for the material to listen to as the packing happens. Notre Dame needs to recruit both these states. 100%. Now, they're already recruiting California, but I have said many times, Ryan, that Notre Dame needs to recruit Tennessee more, the state of Tennessee more. 100%. And that's one of the reasons I've advocated for making Tennessee kind of a new rival, is trying to create a rivalry with Tennessee. It's for that exact reason, is to help you get back into recruiting that state even more effectively. And I think it's a great rivalry. I don't know what it is, but the gold and the orange, that bright orange in the field at the same time, there's just something different about Tennessee's orange compared to other oranges. I don't know what it is. Maybe it's because it's brighter, but I love it. I love it. It could just be a childhood memory because I still remember Rocket having some big returns in that game at Tennessee and how loud that crowd was. And they thought they were going to beat Notre Dame, and Notre Dame went out and beat them. It was a great game. It's a great game. I don't want to talk about the next year's game. I don't want to talk about that one.
Yeah, we'll leave that out.
Yeah, thank you. Josh Phillips says, so that's why Notre Dame needs to beat Ohio State, and hopefully the narrative of Clemsoning goes away. No, that's the thing. It's the only way it goes away is by why did Clemsoning go away? It started before Deshaun Watson showed up. It started even before that. It started when they beat Ohio State in the Orange Bowl after the 2013 season.
Taj Boyd.
Yeah. And then what did they do the next year in the bowl game? They went out and spanked Oklahoma in a bowl game the next year. And then the next year they beat Notre Dame in the regular season. They started beating Florida State with regularity. And then they go into the postseason. They smack Oklahoma again in the college football playoff and then take Bama down to the wire. The next year, 2016, they beat A&M. I believe this A&M is who they beat early in the year. Correct? No, am I? Or was it Auburn? Let me see here. It might have been Auburn actually. Now that I think about it, because A&M was 18 and 17 and 18. No, 18 and 19. So let me just look up Clemson. I think it might have been Auburn. Now that I think about it, they beat Auburn early in the year. Yes, they beat Auburn at Auburn. Beat Louisville with Lamar Jackson, who was ranked 5th at the time. Go out and beat Ohio State 31-0. Beat Alabama, and so the narrative is just destroyed. But they actually got rid of that narrative the year before, and it built up over time. And it started with, again, I believe it started with the Orange Bowl in 2013. Is that season, I think, is kind of when things started to turn around for Clemson, and they started to turn around. Not completely, because they still lost to Florida State and South Carolina that year, and that's where a lot of that came from. Is they can't win big games. Why? Because they got beat by Florida State and South Carolina almost every year when Steve Spurrier was in South Carolina. And then that Ohio State game started to change it. And then they go out in 2014. They lose to Florida State early, but it was an overtime. But then they beat South Carolina late in the year. And then they went on and beat Oklahoma 40-6. But, it started to change then. They still had a bad loss to Georgia early in the season, so it wasn't completely gone. And then 2015 with the win over Notre Dame, it was really started to go away. Then they beat Florida State that year, beat Oklahoma by 20 in the bowl game, and then of course took Alabama down to the wire. And at that point in time, it was gone. I actually went away before they won the championship. Honestly, that's what I think. Like, if they would have not gone back, let's say the loss to Pitt in 2016 would have knocked them out of the playoff. I still don't think the Clemsoning thing is a thing anymore, because they had enough big wins over enough big-time programs and showed that they belonged on that stage that people just stopped talking about it. Because, again, I go back to this, Ryan. I don't think it's just that Notre Dame keeps losing these games that this narrative exists. It's the way that they lose these games. They're not even competitive. And that's the thing. That's where I think that – I could be wrong, but that's where I think that narrative comes from.
I don't disagree with that fact. I think it's definitely the lopsidedness of the losses. But I think for it completely to be erased, though, you need to win those games, right? Like, it's not just a close loss will help reverse it for sure. But to fully destroy it would have to be a win, in my opinion.
And that's what I'm saying about Clemson. They had those wins. They beat Ohio State in an Orange Bowl, and even had a win over LSU. If you remember, after the 2012 season, they beat LSU in the Peach Bowl. But they went out and beat Ohio State in 2013. In 2014, they spanked Oklahoma that year. 2015, they beat Notre Dame. They beat Florida State. Florida State was still good in 2015. They weren't as good as they were, but they were still a 10-plus win team. And then they beat Oklahoma in the playoff. I mean, that's the thing is I'm saying is like they did win those games. They didn't win the – I'm saying is even if they didn't win the ultimate prize of a national championship at that time, I still think the Clemsoning thing goes away. And then the narrative is, hey, Clemson's really good. Can they take that final step? That's a different – I would love to be having that narrative about Notre Dame right now.
Yeah.
Hey, Notre Dame's really good. Are they good enough yet to beat Bama? That's not even people think Notre Dame belongs on the field with Alabama right now. And I understand why. I think it's kind of junk because they earned their way onto that field. They just they didn't, what are you going to do? Just like forfeit because you don't think Notre Dame's good enough? Right? Like, I mean, it's like it's a Broncos fan. He's talking about this. Well, Denver doesn't belong in the Super Bowl. Why? They beat every team in the AFC. Like, of course they belong. That team's just way better. The Niners are just way better. I'm tired of it. And I would love for it to be over with. But it only ends by winning. That's it.
Yes.
That's it, Ryan. It's just winning.
Point blank period to it.
Playing Ohio State tight for 60 minutes is a positive when looking at this 2022 team. And what I mean by that is it can be a confidence builder for this team to go out and do some good things the rest of this year. It still keeps them in the playoff conversation, right? It's about the 2022 team. It's a Florida State type 2014 type loss helps this 2022 football team. It doesn't change the narrative. If that makes sense. Like,
yeah, it does.
They got to go out and beat Clemson for the narrative to start to change. Then they've got to follow that up with a postseason victory over somebody good. Because if they beat Clemson this year and Clemson has a couple losses, then the narrative becomes, well, Clemson, this isn't the same Clemson team. It won't look the same as had you beat Ohio State. So that's it. It's going to take more, but it could be the start of the turnaround. One of those games has to be won for it to be the start of the turnaround, in my opinion. There's no.
You got to make the snowball before you push it down the mountain. So
never heard that before. That's really good.
I just made it
up.
Really
good. Jay Henry, I want to ask you this, Jake. If you could follow up real quick, he says, Brian and Ryan, has there ever been a lost recruit that has tanked the class, i.e., Florida State losing Travis Hunter? I think he's talking about Notre Dame. I think we have seen that before. I'm trying to think back, like tank the class in regard to everybody guys leaving. No, because the 2017 class still kept a lot of guys, but they lost Pete Werner. And but it hurt the class, but that was still a pretty good class. I think of the year Lorenzo Booker picked Florida State. I think really killed that class. Really just completely changed the dynamic because it was kind of like the opposite of the Manti thing. Where when Manti, that was the most fascinating thing. I've actually heard that before. I've heard that about Manti's. He didn't necessarily want to pick Notre Dame. He truly believed that through prayer, God had said, this is where you need to be. And then, of course, the uncle saying, oh, that's cool. Or I think it was an uncle, or maybe it was a coach saying, like, I just thought you instead of going to the USC and being the next whatever, that you'd go to Notre Dame and be the only Manti Te'o. Like, I think that mattered to him. But I also think as a young man of faith that I really felt he felt led to Notre Dame, even though his heart was telling him not to go Notre Dame.
USC.
Yeah. But like that class, to me, it was a really good football class or recruiting class. You had Mo Stovall in that class. You had Raymond McKnight in that class. Derek Landers in that class. James Benelli was a highly ranked player in that class. Hey, here's one. Scott Raridan. Eli Raridan's dad was in that class.
Ooh,
Bob Morton was considered one of the top centers in the country. And Anthony Fasano in that class. Marcus Freeman was in that class. Not the one you're thinking of, the tight end from Minnesota. You had Chris Fromm in that class. Travis Lightco from the Woodlands was a highly ranked guy. But not getting Lorenzo Booker really took the shine off that class. I don't know if I'd say it tanked it, but it took a lot of shine off of that class, in my opinion. So trying to think of like other years. Lorenzo Booker was the number 3 player in the country. Another one, losing Ronald Darby late in the 2012 class. That was rough. That was that class. You think about who that class landed, Ryan. That was a pretty good class. When you look at who they got in that class, you got Ronnie Stanley in that class. You got Romeo Aguiar in that class. You got Kavari Russell in that class. You got some good players in that class. Sheldon Day, Jerron Jones, T. Shepard, C.J. Procise, Elijah Shoemate. But you get Ronald Darby in that class, 5-star corner, big-time player. That class is different. That class is way different. It jumps, in my opinion, way up if that happens. And that's just one of those ones where, you get T. Shepard and Ronald Darby, then the perception about Notre Dame's class changes at the time, but the actual impact would have changed because of Ronald Darby and Kavari Russell. Because Kavari was considered a top, like, 150 kind of guy, but he wasn't considered like, like Ronald Darby was. Ronald Darby was a big-time player. So, yeah, that's one.
Kavari was more of a running back. Really,
correct.
Too,
well,
right?
Notre Dame actually initially recruited him. He played both, but and he was considered an athlete, but Notre Dame was actually recruiting him as a running back. Now, there were some teams recruiting him as a DB, but Notre Dame was actually recruiting him as a running back. He was going to be the running back recruit in that class. But he ended up not obviously playing. He was going to play running back in Notre Dame. It was not getting Ronald Darby and then Low Wood getting hurt in spring ball that resulted in them moving Kavari to running back or corner before he ever showed up. So he was not an early enrollee. Had he been an early enrollee, he probably would have started at running back in the spring. But that changed after they lost Darby and then lost Low Wood to a spring injury. So it's very fascinating. Very fascinating. Quinn Kibler says, Mailbag, can Notre Dame beat Ohio State with less passing yards than Michigan? Michigan had 190. Can they? Yeah, I think they can, but it would have to be exactly like the Michigan game went, Ryan. Well, I don't know if I agree with that. I think the premise being they didn't need to throw for a lot because they completely ran the ball down their throat. And that's why it's you need context. Why are they only passing for 190 yards? Why did Michigan only pass for 190 yards against Ohio State last year? if they couldn't pass for 190 yards last year, well, there's two reasons why. Number one, they ran it down their throat. I mean, just flat out ran it down their throat. They ran for 300. What was it? Ran for 297 yards. The other reason why is they had two huge pass interference penalties that gave them big yardage, but negated the yards a little bit. This is why I laugh when Ohio State fans tell me Denzel Burke didn't give up a single touchdown last year. Okay, my bad. He gave up a 50-yard pass against Michigan where he tackled the guy at the 1 yard line. My bad. Didn't give up a touchdown. But there's also two plays where he got called for pass interference on plays where they might have gone for touchdowns. So, again, context is needed, right? And so when you look at Michigan last year, their quarterback went 14 of 20 for 190 yards and had two big pass interference penalties that kept the yards down, but they ran for 297 yards. If Notre Dame runs for 297 yards against Ohio State and their quarterback goes 13 of 19 for 180 yards, yeah, I think Notre Dame's got a chance to win that football game because they're not going to keep running it if they're losing, you know? I mean, so can they? Yeah. Would I predict it? No. I think that's where Ryan's pushback comes because these teams are built differently. Notre Dame is built to be more of a balanced team. Michigan was built on being a running team. And so I think that's where I would come from. But can they? Yeah, they can. I just don't think that's how it's going to go. I think it's going to be more like if Notre Dame wins, it's going to be more like 215 to 230 running and then generating some big plays in the pass game. I think that's kind of, where they throw for, 240 in the pass game, something like that. There's somewhere around there is where I think it would have to, that to me would be more, I'd be more comfortable with that sweet spot. But yeah, they definitely can. If Michigan could do it last year, then Notre Dame could do it this year, in my opinion. There's no doubt about it. Robert Bishop says, do you guys believe Georgia should be ranked so high after losing so much top-end players to the draft? Odd that Paul Feinbaum only singled out Notre Dame out for being overrated. Well, the only reason he singled only Notre Dame out is because, again, you have to understand what is the purpose of Paul Feinbaum's comments. Do you genuinely think that Paul Feinbaum just got up there and said, you know what, after watching film and really diving into the stats and looking at the records, I think it's ridiculous that Notre Dame is consistently ranked in the top 5, and then make such an absurd statement that they are this way every year and they never finish that high, knowing that in 4 of the last 5 years, they finished higher than what they were in the preseason ranking. And the only year they did finish as high, they were ranked 9th and finished 12th. Technically, they were overrated, but it's probably not an argument. Oh, they were way overrated. Well, what do you mean? Well, they were ranked 9th. Well, they finished 12th. It was terrible. Okay, sure. But technically, they were overrated. So 4 of the last 5 years and 5 of the last 7 years, Notre Dame has finished higher than they were ranked. But the point wasn't to provide analysis. It was to still have us a week later talking about him in articles that I'm writing and on a message board. And that's what ESPN does. That's why I don't watch ESPN. But again, the reason he can make that statement is because of what we talked about before. We'll need to rehash it again.
Yeah. He's also the SEC guy. So that's just is what it is. SEC people hate Notre Dame. It just is what it is. I will say this. I'm a big fan of Georgia won a national championship. I'm fully okay with them being ranked.
You're the champ until somebody beats you, man. That's always been my philosophy.
100%.
I do, however, think that a case could be made for teams in different circumstances. And that's kind of how I felt about LSU in 2020. They lost a ton, not just from the playing standpoint, but number one, number two, they lost a lot of their coaches that had a big role in that. Number one, I didn't like the hires they made, and I don't love the defensive coordinator hire that Kirby made. I don't, and Will Muschamp. I don't love that hire. But Todd Monken's back, and Matt Luke retired, but Stacey Searles is a decent line coach. He's a solid line coach. He's not bad.
Did Matt Luke retire? I missed that.
Yeah. Wow. He wanted to spend more time with his kids. His kids were at that age where he just felt like the pressure of coaching and all, and he just, went out. Yeah. So, but
missed that.
Yeah. But the point for me is there's two big differences between LSU 2020 and Georgia 2022. Number one, track record. Georgia, even before that, they've had losses before and still been pretty good. They have a track record of they're going to be a top team, right? Number one. Number two, they do have their quarterback coming back. And I don't think Stetson Bennett's like this great quarterback, but you know what? He is a pretty clutch kid, right? I've said this before. Stetson Bennett is what Notre Dame coaches thought Ian Book was. He actually is that, but they lost a lot. They have a lot coming back. They had a lot of injuries last year of guys that would have played that didn't play. So am I going to sit there and say, if Ryan says, because we're going to do an IB top 25, actually, we're going to talk about this after the show is over, Ryan and I. But if he has Georgia third, I'm like, dude, what the heck, man? Like, they're the champs. No, I'm not going to say that because I understand it. But I also wouldn't say if I had him third and Ryan had him one, I'm not going to be like, dude, they lost 15 guys. Like, they lost this guy. No, you're the champ until somebody's beat you. I believe that. And, so if for all the talk we talk about, if Georgia goes out there and goes 12-0 in the regular season, nobody else should be ranked number one. Nobody should be ranked number one except for them until somebody beats them. Then you can talk about it, and plenty of teams will get their chance. So that's kind of how I think about that. But I also think that it's a situation where I think people can have different opinions on it, Ryan. I don't think it's the rule. It should be the rule. And like, there's some things like when I see people vote, I'm like, if you have that team there, you should not be voting. Like, I'm sorry, shouldn't be voting. But I also think that this is one of those ones people have difference of opinion because you can focus more on what's coming up and less on what happened, and then with what's coming up, there are question marks at Georgia. Bama has less question marks perception wise. Ohio State has less question marks perception wise than the other team does. And so that's where I'm at with that. So, all right. So that is going to do it for today's show. A lot of fun, everybody. Thank you so much for the great questions. We really appreciate it. Before you go, hit that like button, hit the subscribe button, hit the notification bell, share this podcast, and definitely sign up for the message boards@irishbreakdown.com. If you're listening via podcast, give us a 5-star review. We would greatly appreciate it. And tomorrow we'll be here Wednesday, and we'll be one day closer to Notre Dame, Ohio State. So thanks everybody for joining us. Ryan, great stuff today. Glad to hear that Jules is doing much better, back in good spirits, and appreciate all of y'all for keeping Ryan and his family in your prayers. So have a good one, everybody. Thank you for joining us on the Irish Breakdown Podcast.